All right. Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Design a Play. This is episode 10. We finally made it to the 10th episode. My time flies. What a long year to go through 2020, but also a great year to start this whole discussion system. Thank you, everyone who has been here and supported and watched and been part of the discussions for the 10 different episodes. It's been quite a fun time. Things have changed over this period. Obviously, it was supposed to be my original plan was to play the game, spend a week researching it, and then host a discussion. Week is definitely not enough time. I actually don't even think it was supposed to be a week. I think it was supposed to be like a weekend. I think it was supposed to be like 3 or 4 days or something to get the research done and then have the discussion afterwards, and that got pushed back to about a week of discussion of research and gathering information. Then I pushed it back to 2 weeks. I was like, you know what, I just have to have some discipline and make sure I get the work done on the research and just present it when I think I'm ready, when I think I have the information available and ready. So it's usually about like 3 weeks usually, I would say. It depends on what the game is specifically, but that Portal discussion was a very important lesson to me, to learn that I can't just exactly force this out on a schedule. I definitely work a little bit better when I have when I can actually present the information, have the discussion when I feel like I'm ready. So yeah, we've gone through quite a few changes, and I mean, if you go back and look at the first episode of the discussion, it is drastically different to how we had in the first one. Besides the fact I didn't even have a layout ready for the first one, but the first episode, I went back and watched the VOD and saw how much my webcam was shaking. Got a ceiling mount for the webcam, so yeah, it's just kind of cool to go back and look at the to see how much things have changed over a short period of only 10 episodes. So still more to improve, still more to do, and I can't wait to see where it goes from here in the future. But I think that's pretty much all I have to talk about on the before we actually get to the main subject. So let's actually get to the game itself. So we'll talk about Doom 2016. So Doom 2016 came out May 13th, 2016, obviously, and this game was made by id Software. id Software is known for quite a few different major franchises and IPs. The first one that they created was the Commander Keen series. This came out very, very long time ago. I believe 1992, if I remember correctly, was the first one. And while id had been making games beforehand, this is the first game that they had made originally completely by themselves. It was their first own original product. Keen was supposed to be a proof of concept of basically Mario working on PC. See, the thing is, way back then in the ancient times of 1991, 1992, PCs were vastly inferior to home consoles when it came to video games, and smooth side-scrolling was thought to be impossible on PCs. It just was not powerful enough to do that. And one of the programmers on the team, John Carmack, had very outside-of-the-box thinking, was able to think of a unique way to program an engine that would make smooth side-scrolling actually possible in the first place. And with that engine created, he and his small group of friends, they recreated Super Mario Bros. 3 in its entirety on PC and sent it to Nintendo in hopes that they would be willing to work with them to port the game to PC. However, Nintendo respectfully declined, said they were not interested in moving it to PC. And shortly afterwards, a new publisher had reached out to id, asking them to publish. For asking it to create a game and that they would publish it and share the profits. And one of the members on the team suggested that they make their own 2D platformer with the engine that Carmack had created, and that eventually became the Commander Keen series. 1990. Okay, so December 1990, just before the turn of the new year into 1991. Okay, wow, that's right. Wolfenstein was 1992, because I knew that Doom was 1993 and I knew that Keen was before it. Obviously, I just didn't quite remember the exact time period in which it came out beforehand. So it was 1990, just before 1991. Sorry, cold weather. My nose is driving me nuts. So after the Commander Keen games, they had 2 trilogies, and then we went into Wolfenstein 3D. Now, this was the next IP franchise series that id would work on originally as their own. However, they did not create this one entirely. Wolfenstein first and foremost, is an FPS very similar to Doom. While most people think of Doom as the father of the FPS genre, the first-person shooter genre, Wolfenstein is mostly seen as the grandfather, because Wolfenstein was kind of a proof of concept of Doom, and Doom was built upon a lot what was built in that was established in Wolfenstein. And so following the two Keen trilogies, it decided they wanted to make a new game with the engine that Carmack had been making. And the first thing that came to mind was Castle Wolfenstein, which was an older PC game. And they were, excited, but also figured they would not be able to do it because, they did not own the IP. So they contacted the original owners to see if they could get the approval to make a new Castle Wolfenstein game. Turns out the company who had made the original Wolfenstein game was no longer around. They were gone, and they had let the trademark lapse. So they were more than welcome to create their own Wolfenstein game, and that became Wolfenstein 3D. The series is still being made today, as the very popular game that put it back on the map in the public minds of people was Wolfenstein: The New Order. Very, very successful, very, very well received. I was planning on playing it. I would like to, and I plan to do it at some point for the discussion, because I did not realize when I started the research into Doom 1993, I had no idea how significant Wolfenstein as a game was, and realized that I probably should put on my list of things to do. And then also, just like I did 1993 Doom and 2016 Doom, I would probably do the same thing with Wolfenstein, the 1992 release, and the New Order release as well. But in the past 2 months, I have gone through every single Doom game. I've done Doom 1, 2, and 3, Doom 64, Doom 2016, Doom Eternal. I've done so much research on Doom 1993 and Doom 2016. Its software has been consumed my life for the past 2 to 3 months. I love the games. I love the series. They make fantastic games. I need a bit of a break. So I will probably get to doing Wolfenstein at some point, but it probably won't be anything in the near future. Also, hi Electric and hi Matthias. I will be happy to teach you the history of ripping and tearing, because now Wolfenstein New Order is still in the recent public mind, and people absolutely loved it, and there's still being new games made today. After Wolfenstein, they made Doom, the 1993 release, and I have done a full discussion on Doom. That was episode 9. This is episode 10. I did the discussion on Doom 1993. Basically, Doom itself, the game was it established the genre, the rules and formula for the FPS genre itself, and it still is heavily influential to this day. The first one was released back in 1993 and was a huge, massive phenomenon, and was able to reach the mainstream even without the help of any kind of major publisher of any kind. Its widespread success was just so massive that it was one of the go-to games that people brought up when the topic of video games being poison to society whenever it was brought up. So it was usually Doom was brought up right alongside Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. So it was very, very popular, both in the underground of video games, but also in the mainstream mind. And Doom itself had 3 main releases that were made by id. The third one coming out as recent as August 2004. It would take 12 years following that game before a new game came out, and that would be Doom 2016, the game we're going to be talking about today. The other major IP that it had made was Quake. Quake is a series that would follow up the Doom series, and it was released in 1996, 2 years after Doom 2 was released. And that would make it 8 years before the release of Doom 3. And to be honest, I don't really know a whole lot about Quake. And Quake itself is also massively influential. I believe it's kind of, well, obviously speedrunning had always existed. The term, the sort of competitive nature of speedrunning in a online space between people in terms of tracking it and comparing it, that really is can kind of be traced to Quake, as far as I understand, as one of the origin points. So Quake itself is pretty yep, that's right. And Metroid Prime as well. I learned about that too. It was Quake, and then Metroid Prime was the next one to be on it, because Quake speedruns were shared on a certain website, and it was called Quake Done Quick, I believe, and eventually they spread out to a new website that was, I can't remember what it's called, but it was more generalized in title with speedrunning, even though it was almost entirely Quake speedruns. And Metroid Prime, someone had realized that they can glitch around with it, and they decided to upload the video on there. Like, why not? This is not like a Quake only thing. It doesn't say it in the name or anything. So it was Quake originally, and Metroid Prime was the one that came after, which is kind of funny because I had no idea. If anything, I would have expected Super Metroid to be. Yes, Speed Demos Archive. Thank you. Because it was called a demo. That's right. Whenever you would play through a level in Doom, or sorry, I think it was also Doom, but in Quake, you would download something called a demo, download it, and it would basically save your inputs as a TAS essentially, and play it back. And so it was a Speed Demos Archive. It was an archive of all the speed demos that you created. Thank you. So yeah, Quake is very significant for many different reasons, but I personally don't know much about the game itself, so I can't really talk about it. But just know that when it comes to id, Quake is very, very large, a landmark IP in the video game genre, the video game entertainment industry as a whole, right up there with Doom and Wolfenstein. Anyways, this is a tangent. Still a very interesting tangent. Oh, and then Metroid Prime set up to any percent, 100%. Oh, that makes sense because the percent system is usually the go-to, because there's the argument about what's any percent, what's 100%, but Metroid is usually one of the go-to reference points because it actually has an in-game percentage counter. Also true. Yeah. Tangents, but still cool stuff. Anyway, the final IP that it has made, I keep wanting to say that Doom has made, that it has made, was Rage, and that came out in 2011. This is a game that was being developed at the same time that Doom 2016 was, and Rage came out in 2011. And Rage is a game that took place in a post-apocalyptic landscape after an asteroid crashes into Earth. And just like Quake, I don't really know too much about this series either personally. But the other thing is, this is probably one of the only series of one of the only IPs of its that's not monumental or groundbreaking in some way. Its roots are not tied to something huge in the evolution of gaming. Commander Keen was about the 2D side-scrolling. Wolfenstein was the establishing of the modern FPS formula. Doom was the establishment of it and breaking into the mainstream and setting that formula for everyone else. Quake had a lot of influence in terms of speedrunning, as well as I know there's more to it than that, but Rage is just kind of the black sheep when it comes to its catalog of games, the catalogs of IPs. So those are the games that id themselves is known for. Oh, I forgot to. That's the Rage cover, by the way. Also, Rage is still being made. They had one, I think, that came out in 2018, 2019, maybe somewhere around that time. I can't quite remember specifically. But yeah, those are the games that id are most known for. So we'll take a brief moment to kind of cover the history of Doom itself, the IP, because I did have a full discussion. That was episode 9, that was Doom 1993, where I cover everything from start to finish that has to do with the development history of Doom, when we break down and analyze major important things and standout moments of the game itself. Talk about what about is influential and groundbreaking and everything like that. Really, really cool, fascinating stuff. You hear about how, you know, older games really do evolve. We're establishing a lot of different things and how video games evolve over time. It's kind of hard to understand just how primitive video games were just, 30 years ago, back in 1993. And Doom was, luckily that book chronicled all the important things. I mean, there had been existed, I'm sure, games that had at some point maybe had textured ceilings, but it was a mind-blowing thing that Doom had varying heights to the ceilings instead of just being infinite heights. It's just really, really crazy stuff. So it's a really interesting discussion, but in case you don't have the I think it was 3 hours to listen to discussion, I'll break down a very basic summary of the history of the Doom IP as a whole. JJ, thank you for the 48. That is awesome. How are you doing? Thank you for the 4 years. So, Doom itself was the result of a small group of friends who just desperately wanted to create in general. Their drives and motivations, each of them were different from each other, but when you combine all of them together was just a recipe for an amazing game. So one of them wanted to create dark, twisted artwork, One of them wanted to evolve programming to be faster and more powerful than it had ever been before. One just wanted to create a fun video game more than anything else. Doom was an outlet for the artist. It was a showcase for the programmer, and it was a chance to fine-tune the gameplay that they had worked on in previous IPs to create a just amazing, fun experience for the gamer of the group. Again, hate that word. And it was just, when you combine all those together, it was a smash success. And on top of it, their business partner, Jay Wilbur, found a way to take advantage of their already very unorthodox method of selling the games. They were doing a shareware type of model. And he took advantage of it in a way that would basically make it so it would sell even more copies than ever before. And the team was just making money hand over fist. It was crazy, crazy successful. Doom was essentially a perfect storm of ideas, and a storm of ideas and creative minds in a market that really just wasn't willing to push the waters content-wise the way that it themselves was. So it just was just, again, the perfect storm, and it established many of the rules that the FPS genre still to this day follows and looks back to for inspiration. So that was the original Doom. Then we had Doom 2, which, in my opinion, the best way to summarize Doom 2 is Doom but more. It's more levels, more enemies, and more difficult. This was pretty normal for the trajectory when it came to its making games. While Carmack was making a new engine, the team would take what was already established and created for the previous game and build upon it even more and create more content for it. That's basically what they did with Wolfenstein while Carmack was working on the engine for that would eventually become the engine used for Doom. Wolfenstein 3D had been created, and the team would take all the assets and everything that had been created before, and they create an expansion pack. That's basically what Doom 2 was as well. It's the lost levels for Doom 1, basically. Yeah, that's a good way to put it as well. So that was Doom 2. Very simple. Then we had Doom 3. This was its take on making Doom a Doom game with more story and narrative. It was very dark and very atmospheric. It was very breathtakingly beautiful and detailed for its time, but it was really, really polarizing to many fans because it was more akin to survival horror than it was a game that was fast-paced action shooter. So it was a huge deviation from what most people expected from Doom. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people hate it. So that's pretty much all that we got for the background info on the series, on the IP, the studio who made it, and everything like that. So let's talk about the development of Doom, because it is a fun one. All right, so when you look at Doom 2016 and you look at the final product, you'd expect that its development went pretty well. It's got a great primary gameplay loop, which, if you don't know what a primary gameplay loop is, it's basically like the core idea, mechanic, or function that you build everything else around upon. So like Mario games, the primary gameplay loop is jumping. You jump on top of enemies to kill them, you jump over platforms to progress forward, you jump and hit blocks for coins or for items. The primary gameplay loop in Luigi's Mansion is the vacuum. You suck up the ghosts to damage them. You use the vacuum to blow out candles. You use the vacuum to absorb elements and fire in the back, and use them to pull sheets and do everything. You use the vacuum to interact the world, so the use of the vacuum is the primary gameplay loop. Doom had a fantastic primary gameplay loop. It had very well polished mechanics. It was very quick. It was responsive. It did not have many bugs or glitches or issues. I say that as someone who has not watched the speedrun. I'm sure people find amazing, wonderful ways to break the shit out of game when it comes to speedruns. I'm just talking from a casual gameplay experience standpoint. I don't know of many people who had anything to say about their experiences being buggy, inconsistent, problematic, glitchy, frustrating. Well, frustrating for those types of reasons. So yeah, you look at all this, and Doom was a very, very solid final product when it came to release, so you would expect that the development went pretty smooth. When in reality, the development of Doom 2016 was very, very tumultuous, to put it gently. There were many team members who left during the game's development. The development process was entirely reboot. Oops. Sorry, good old Discord bloop. My bad. Forgot to put it into streamer mode. What a perfect time to have that happen. Anyway, The development process was actually rebooted entirely a couple years, I think it was 5 years into development almost. How information about the game was trickled out and given to the public was very spotty and inconsistent. And at one point, they even had some team members go and talk to members of the gaming press to talk about just how bad the development of the game was going. Doom 2016 over the years was throwing up every single red flag that could be raised from a consumer standpoint, that there is problems, that this is not going to be a good product, but the game still turned out to be great. So let's talk. Let's start from the very, very beginning of this process. We'll start from the first mentioning of Doom itself. This was by John Carmack at QuakeCon 2007. This is so long ago. First mention was by John Carmack at QuakeCon in 2007. So around QuakeCon took place August 1st to August 5th, so somewhere in that window. And we'll talk about Rage during an interview because, again, Rage was their main game they were working on at the point they asked about Doom. And Carmack said, yes, there will be a Doom 4. They didn't have anything scheduled. They didn't have a team assigned to it yet, but there will be a Doom 4. So this is back in August of 2007. And then you fast forward almost a year to May 2008. And this was the first time finally the game officially itself was announced, but they did it in a very odd way to announce it. It announced that they were working on Doom 4 and were looking for talent to hire to help create the game. There wasn't a press release, there wasn't an advertising campaign or anything like that. It was essentially announcement that Doom 4 was being created through a help wanted sign. So that was in May, and then a couple months later in August, John Carmack was speaking to The Escapist and acknowledged some of the criticisms directly that were had about Doom 3. So he said the complaints about monsters, the mentality of like monsters hiding in the closet kind of feeling, and the emphasis on darkness were very valid grievances that a lot of players had. He said that as a result of these problems that players had, Doom 4 would be much more similar to Doom 2 than it was to Doom 3. There was actually a very good quote that he said during the article that I pulled out. It said, "It's not that you're running around frightened down to your last bullet." He continued explaining how the game will be more about kicking ass than really surviving. There will occasionally be that, but it should be much more of you winning, because that was always the point in Doom. You are the hero. You are winning. You're going to beat back all the hordes of hell using all the tools at your disposal. He wanted players to say, "I'm victorious," not "I'm not dead," thankfully. He just felt that saying that, I'm victorious was just fundamentally much more rewarding. Reminds me of Prime 4 and Retro occasionally putting up a new position on the website for the environment creation manager or something. Yeah, they're like, games will, obviously they need to find new people, and by being secretive and quiet and much more reserved that they're looking for people makes it difficult to find those people. But the difference is we all know Prime 4 is in the works, is being made, whereas Doom 4 was something that was like, yeah, we plan on making it eventually, but we don't have a team on it, to the first announcement that it's being made is a help wanted sign specifically to work on the game. Also, very, very important thing to note, Carmack felt so strongly on these comments. He took it so much to heart about people's problems with Doom 3's direction that it actually redirected the course of development for Rage itself. Rage was originally going to be a game called Darkness, and as you can imagine, the game was going to be very, very dark. The backlash, though, for Doom 3's style caused the team to actually pivot and go to a completely different place than their usual style of dark and evil style types of games, and that's how we ended up with Rage in the setting it was actually located in. It was still obviously a very hostile environment, but it was much more bright in aesthetics as opposed to the typical dark locations that you think of with games made by id. We did get a big logo in space, then a follow-up. We're rebooting the whole thing before that. The whole thing with Prime is just, I feel so bad because I would say it's not uncommon for games in modern day times to take about 4 years to make. I think that's pretty accurate. Maybe 3 years, but usually from the early concept, very beginning stages, I would say from that point on, usually it's about 4 years afterwards when you actually get the final product of the game. with Metroid Prime, because they had announced it, they were probably at least 2 years into development, maybe closer to 3, but then the game got completely reset. So fans would have to wait at most 2 years for the game to come out. And then after a year of announcement, they restarted the entire process. So you restart it, you have another 4 years to build the game, but fans had already been waiting a year. So while most fans wait at most 2 years for a game in most cases, with Nintendo usually a year or less, now they have to wait 5 years for the game. It's just, oh, I feel so bad about the development of Prime 4. Poor game. Feel awful. So, where was I? Carmack was talking with The Escapist in August of 2008 to talk about how he took the criticism to heart. And then a couple months later, in April of 2009, Todd Hollenshed, who was the then CEO of id Software, told GameSpot in an interview that the game could arguably still be seen as being in pre-production, but that the team were still being hired and worked on. So it was still pretty early in development, that they hadn't even gotten past potentially the pre-production stage, which is, you know, kind of the planning stages of everything before they actually go into full-fledged working mode and actually having a more solid, concise idea as to where they're going. And then just a few months later, on June 23rd, 2009, ZeniMax purchased id Software and announced that all future id games would be published by Bethesda. That would be including Doom 4. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the name ZeniMax, that's not abnormal, but I guarantee you know at least one of the games that they're responsible for. If anything, I feel like ZeniMax is probably a little more in the public mind as of recently, because there was a massive news story about Microsoft acquiring them. So as of right now, people might be more familiar, but before that whole story, I imagine most people had absolutely no idea who ZeniMax was. So ZeniMax owns a small list of very major developers. So first we have Arcane Studios. This is the studio that is responsible for having created the Dishonored series. They're also the ones who created the Prey game, as well as they are the ones in charge of the upcoming Deathloop game. So they have a pretty friggin' fantastic reputation when it comes to the games that they've made. So they have Arcane Studios. They also own Tango Gameworks. This actually was really interesting. I learned about this during my research. This is apparently the studio that was created by Shinji Mikami. This is the guy who was responsible for the early Resident Evil games when he worked at Capcom before he split off and created his own studio. That was Tango Gameworks, and it's owned by ZeniMax. They are the studio that's responsible for the Evil Within series, and they're also the ones responsible for the upcoming Ghostwire Tokyo. This game looks friggin' awesome. I'm so excited for this one. Also, Deathloop looks fantastic too. Man, ZeniMax got some good studios. So they have Tango Gameworks. They also have Machine Games. Machine Games is most known for having created the Wolfenstein the new series of Wolfenstein games, and they are also the ones who were just recently announced to be in charge of the upcoming Indiana Jones game. So a lot of people are excited about that as well. And then the last one, the big game, the big series, the big developer that most people know, that is owned by ZeniMax, Bethesda Studios, of course. So Bethesda is obviously known for having made the Elder Scroll games, the Elder Scroll series. They made all of them, I found out, and from the very beginning. And they also are responsible for the Fallout series. They started with Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and 76, everyone's favorite. But I always thought that Bethesda was in charge of Fallout from the beginning, but no, the first two Fallout games were made by another studio before Bethesda acquired them. So ZeniMax was in charge, owned Arcane, Tango Gameworks, Machine Games, as well as Bethesda, and now it was joining the family. Ghostwire Tokyo. I know. I remember when I was looking at it, I was like, oh, no fucking way. I forgot about this game. Looks great. Hi, Dibs. Dishonored is the oldest game in my Steam library. I have not played, though it's not old. Dishonored's great. Dishonored's awesome. Again, when it comes to stealth games are almost always only good when the game is built around stealth, as opposed to just kind of a tacked on mechanic at the end. And Dishonored was just such a fun game. Really cool aspect to the pacifist method or not. It's just, I won't say too much. Dishonored's a great game. I've still not played Dishonored 2 and I want to, but Dishonored is absolutely worth the playthrough. So yeah, ZeniMax acquired id Software June 23rd, 2009. Now, a studio acquisition while in the middle of developing a game can be a huge speed bump when it comes to game development. I'm sure some contracts had to be renegotiated. Publishing rights for games exchanged hands during this time. For example, EA was originally supposed to be the publisher for Rage, but that ended up being handed over to Bethesda, and Bethesda ended up taking care of the publishing rights to that game. So contracts had to be renegotiated. Staff is moved around as the company is merged, and some people are found to have their expertise work better in different places and different buildings. People will move around. But that also can mean new people are brought into the studio from the outside, from outside sources and other companies, and a place has to be set up for them. They have to be integrated. On top of people moving to and from the studio, you also have management is usually and frequently shaken up. With a new acquisition, the chain of command is shifted or usually just elongated in some way. And the new owner will usually place some new people from their company into the ranks of the newly acquired studio. And people have to adjust to the new management, which can be a process. Very, very difficult process for some people. And then on top of that, all these new staff and management members who are brought in have to be brought up to speed on the project that up until the point that it's been at so far. So there's a lot of issues that come with a major acquisition. However, this acquisition also brought a list of benefits to id Software and Doom 4. With the new parent company overseeing id, they can now sink lots of resources into the game, like money. Now they have a lot more capital to make the games, as well as hire new staff, and money makes making games a lot easier. So that's a big one. Of course, there's the new employees that they have access to, as well as new outsourcing opportunities. When you have these new studios that you can work with, this new parent company, their resources become your resources eventually. And the big benefit to being owned by a new company is that in the past, id was a very small company that normally had their entire staff working on one game at a time. However, with the new capital, the new money provided by ZeniMax, id could actually expand and have two teams working on two games at one time. So the team working on Rage, once they were finished with their game, they could move on over and help the team that had been working on Doom 4 at that point. So after the acquisition by ZeniMax, things went quiet for quite some time, and not much was heard about Doom 4 or really much from id at that point. Not until almost 4 years later. Well, I guess I shouldn't say not much from id. Most of it was focused on the actual development and release of Rage itself, their new IP people were excited for. But in terms of any kind of news or information related to Doom, there was almost none, which is pretty surprising, again, since they were acquired by ZeniMax and they had the ability to have two teams. One could be working on Doom at all times. You figured there would be some kind of new information to come out, but apparently not. So then, in 4 years later, in April of 2013, Jason Schreier of Kotaku posted an article that talks about how Doom 4 was in development hell and that it was plagued with mismanagement and communication issues. The article made waves in the video game community when it came out, as a lot of people had their suspicions that Doom 4's development wasn't really going too well, since there hadn't been much word about it for some time, and the article seemed to validate pretty much all the concerns that the public was having about the game. Excuse me. In the article, four different members connected to the development of Doom 4 contacted him and gave their experiences of the game's development up until that point. Doom 4, we found out, was supposed to be a rework or reimagining of Doom 2. This was supposed to run parallel to the idea that Doom 3 was sort of a reimagining of Doom 1. In the original concept for the game, you were not going to play as Doom Guy, the ultimate killing machine, but you were going to play as John Doe, a regular guy. You were going to be an everyday normal person convinced to join a resistance group that was fighting back against the demons that had begun taking over Earth. Because again, Doom 1 took place on Mars, Doom 2 took place on Earth. There was a lot of scripted sequences and pieces, to the point that it was just a common joke for developers to refer to the game as Call of Doom, actually. There was a sort of understanding that in order for a shooter to be successful at this time point in the industry, that the game had to have some degree of these big bombastic movie experiences. One of the sources described excuse me. One of the sources described the scene in the game as obligatory vehicle scene, where a player would just man a gun in a vehicle as the computer drove along the path, and the player would just gun down any kind of demons that were along the way. The game did have some redeemable points, though, that were usually focused on horror or shock elements, but even these were usually bookended by segments of just boring shooting galleries with hordes of uninteresting enemies. According to these sources, leadership at id didn't really pay much attention to Doom 4's development for years. This was likely due to the management focusing so much more on Rage, because that was their new IP and that needed a lot more guidance, whereas Doom was an established idea with a lot of core principles, and assumed the team that was working on Doom 4 would have a lot more previous material to go off of, so it wouldn't need as much of a close eye to watch over as Rage did. When higher-ups eventually did come to look at the progress of Doom 4, they didn't like what they saw, saying that the game didn't live up to their expectations, it wasn't good enough, and would instead need to change direction. This was really, really frustrating to the team who was working on the game, as management basically ignored the game for 3 years and wouldn't give it the time of day, and once they finally did, response from management was, okay, this is garbage, we're gonna have to change a bunch of stuff now. So eventually there was a decision made to reboot the game, and once that decision was made, many people were initially very happy because a lot thought that reboot was long overdue. And also during this reboot process, a lot of management apparently changed, so I'm sure a lot of people were happy about that as well. And at one point during Doom 4's rebooting development process, they had a massive team meeting where company leaders talked about what Doom meant to them. And John Carmack apparently was attending the meeting, and at one point stood up and said something to the notion of Doom means two things: demons and shotguns. So they were definitely on the right track. But the morale boost was very short-lived as new issues were rising with the subpar release of Rage. Rage came out and just didn't do gangbusters commercially or critically, so plans for DLC were scaled back pretty significantly, as well as the sequel that was planned to be in the works was canceled. ZeniMax also came down at this point and decided to get a little bit more involved with the development process for id. Their viewpoint was, we gave you guys a bunch of chances and we can see that you guys are struggling a little bit when it comes to managing multiple projects like this, so from this point on you guys are just going to have one project to work on at a time, and in this case it's going to be Doom 4. So while this was definitely a good decision to make, I think the really big downside to this is just in the blink of an eye, the massive benefit that id had gotten by being acquired by ZeniMax, the ability to have two teams working on two games at one time, was just now gone, as now they were only allowed to work on one project at a time. So now, since the two teams were combined into one, the managers for Doom and Rage had a bit of an internal struggle, a bit of a power struggle, as they figured out how to merge their teams together. Both of the teams have worked together for their own but both teams have worked together with their own groups for years and created their own type of work culture that really worked for those individual groups. Now they were being mashed together at once with very little time to adjust. Just as a little side note, this is actually kind of interesting too, because a lot of people were nervous when they found out that Rage was being made at the same time as Doom, because they were worried that Rage was going to be a reskin of Doom or Doom was going to be a reskin of Rage, and those worries were addressed as they said that the teams that were working on both of the games were kept pretty significantly separate from each other. And in the article, this was said that they had issues coming back together and being combined into one team because the two teams had created their own work culture because they were so separate from each other. So at least they weren't lying on that part. Not to say that people in the industry are constantly lying, obviously, all the way. It's just nice to know. I just like to point to these examples whenever people say, because there is that common, I feel like there's that general understanding that a lot of people assume anyone in the industry, when they're speaking publicly, are lying or exaggerating or just trying to make things sound better than they are. But so I like to point to specific examples of them saying, no, at this point they said this and this backs it up. So So despite the reboot, the game's direction was apparently quite a mess, as one of the sources for the article said that the story, they described the story as lame and unfit for a late night sci-fi channel. So there was just so many problems in this article. It was really shocking to read all of it. As well as a lot of the team members working on the game didn't really feel a whole lot of ownership on the game that they were making. And they also just felt like they weren't really contributing much to the final product of the game itself. And this eventually led to a conga line of top level talent pretty much just walking out the door and leaving id, either through firings or by quitting. So again, all of this information came out in April 2013, more than 5 years after development had begun, and 3 years before the release of the final release. 3 years before Doom would finally release to the public. And something also that's really important to note, at the time of this Kotaku article, when it came out, Doom 4 had not officially been announced at that point yet. There was, again, they had that help wanted sign to try to find people to work for the game, but they still had not made a formal announcement of the game being made. So when people saw this Kotaku article and saw that how plagued the development of Doom 4 was, a lot of people's response was, wait, there's a Doom 4 and it's canceled? So yeah, there were a lot of people who were obviously worried, because they had known that it was being developed for quite some time and had these worries and concerns. And this article confirmed those concerns. But then also the other problem that it had was people who had no idea about the development of this game, who therefore did not have concerns for the game, learned about the game through this article and were like, wait, what the fuck? This game is a mess. What's going on? So this was just a very, very big blow publicly for Doom 4, the game, as well as the I wouldn't say the credibility of it, but it was a big talking point for a while. So as I said before, the game was rebooted, and this was around the turn of the year between 2012 and 2013. And the generalized response that the public received for the reasoning why it was rebooted was it just didn't really feel like a Doom game. So at QuakeCon 2013, which took place the first week of August, Tim Willits, id studio director, explained to IGN why the game was rebooted and why it was given a fresh start. And there was a quote in there that said, "It wasn't like the art was bad or the programming was bad. Every game has a soul. Every game has a spirit. When you played Rage, you got the spirit. And Doom 4 did not have the spirit. It did not have the soul. It didn't have a personality. It had a bit of schizophrenia, a little bit of an identity crisis. It didn't have the passion and soul of what an id game is. Everyone knows the feeling of Doom, but it's very hard to articulate." So the team essentially looked at the game and they all agreed what they had wasn't a bad game, but it wasn't good enough. It wasn't great. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't something that really lived up to the hype and expectations of the Doom IP, and it didn't deliver on the idea of what people waited all this time for, and it needed to be worth the wait. The team also didn't want anyone to look at the game and have the reaction that everyone working on the game was still stuck in the 90s. So we finally got some kind of public acknowledgement of Doom itself and where it was at in development. So another major blow to the game's public image was John Carmack eventually leaving id in November of 2013. It's been speculated that the reason that Carmack left was because Doom 4 was having a lot of trouble, but as I discussed in the Doom 1993 discussion video, Carmack was all about pushing the limits of coding and technology. Even back in the early 90s, Carmack was all about virtual reality and just full immersive games as much as possible. So it's not a huge surprise that Carmack left id to go work at Oculus, where he could finally work on one of the biggest advancements that gaming had that really wasn't all that explored yet. So there's lots of speculation as to why he left, but we won't know for sure. Regardless, John Carmack leaving id was a major blow because he was the last original member of id Software since the beginning. So finally, at QuakeCon 2014, an announcement trailer for Doom, now called Doom 2016, Well, actually, it wasn't even called Doom 2016. It was just rebranded as Doom, which, let me take a second to say, stop that. Stop that. Please stop that. I understand there's the idea that when a game is called, you know, it's the 7th in the series or it's the 5th in the series, a lot of people get nervous and they feel like, oh, I haven't played these other 4 games leading up to this, so I won't be able to get into the game, or it feels daunting, or it feels like maybe there's the movie issue where people just see sequels and they think it's shit. I understand there's lots of reasons. Please stop making new games and calling them the original one. It makes it an absolute fucking nightmare to research because it's so hard to differentiate between the two of them. It just gets confusing for discussion purposes. This discussion, but any kind of discussion between people, it's just, please stop doing it. It's a nightmare. It's just so unnecessarily confusing. God of War does it. Sonic the Hedgehog does it. Please stop it. Oh my God. Don't do that. So anyway, Doom was now just called Doom, which I will be calling Doom 2016 from now on, out of pure fucking spite. Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy does it right. Final Fantasy does, they're up to 15. They're working on 16 right now. They're doing it the right way. I appreciate the way that they do it. Anyway, so QuakeCon 2014, Doom was finally shown to the public. An announcement trailer was shown. It was rebranded, no longer Doom 4. It was called just Doom. Here's the big problem, though. It wasn't streamed. The trailer was not uploaded anywhere. And fucking somehow, I don't know how they did this, but the team at QuakeCon asked the audience to turn off their phones and not record the trailer, and everyone listened. I don't know how. So they showed the footage of the trailer, and it never uploaded anywhere online. It has finally been uploaded in snippets in the No Clip documentary. No Clip did a documentary on Doom 2016, and they gave the footage to No Clip, and they show certain segments from a crowd perspective. So there is little bits you could see there, but the actual trailer itself that was shown at QuakeCon was never actually uploaded anywhere in its entirety. So, and this documentary came out, I think, in 2016. So the trailer was at QuakeCon 2014. We only have seen snippets finally 2 years later, 2016. So again, no one had actually seen the trailer except for the people who were at the event. This was a really big problem because Doom was still dealing with some public perception issues with things like the absurd development time, a requirement for the development to be rebooted, an article detailing all of the poor management decisions, the lack of communication from the devs to the public, top-level talent was leaving the studio, the last of the one of those people being the last original creator of Doom, so they no longer had anyone from the original team there. And now finally, when the team had something to show in the form of a trailer, they only showed it to a very small, closed-off audience that was never uploaded or shared to the public for the world to see. So from the outside looking in, it seemed like the team at id had no clear direction where they were going, and they had no confidence in the game they were making. So instead of showing a game that they're proud of to the world, they meekly showed it to a small room of their biggest fanboys and yes men. In an interview with IGN, Bethesda's VP of PR and marketing, Pete Hines, said that the reason that they did the closed off reveal was actually to counter fears and troubles at id Software, funny enough. The team working on id didn't want to make a full public showing of the game yet. If the trailer was streamed and uploaded, every single frame would be combed through and analyzed, and any minor detail would have been picked apart. Every last little bit of it would have been critiqued. And this would have been done to a product that the team themselves didn't feel comfortable showing to the world yet. However, the rumors going around the game was that the game was in a horrible state, and all the doubts about id Software, quote unquote, bothered the hell out of Pete Hines, and he wanted to respond in some way. Hines' goal was to put something out there that very strongly said it is working on something great and they think that the fans will like it. He wanted to give fans confidence that the team was working on. Was something the devs took very seriously. So the idea of showing a closed trailer of the game in progress at QuakeCon, he thought would renew the confidence in id Software through positive word of mouth from attendees at the event. QuakeCon attendees would be rewarded for attending the event, and then Bethesda would be able to go back to being quiet about Doom until they felt they were ready to talk about it. That was the mind state of Pete Hines and the people who made the decision to show the trailer. After this behind-the-scenes reveal at QuakeCon, IGN said that it's unlikely that anyone will see anything about Doom until next year, and they were spot on. Following the following E3 on June 15th, 2015, Doom was finally announced and shown with a gameplay trailer. This definitely helped bolster the reputation with the game, now that there was actual tangible gameplay to be seen, and it looked pretty good, but there were still some other issues. Some people were not sold on the glory kill system, saying it was too slow and give a weird pacing to the fights. Bethesda had started its major fall from grace in the public eye with its recent initiative to try to make players pay for mods on Steam, which, holy shit, I forgot about that until I was doing the research. I forgot how much of a shitstorm that was. And again, Bethesda was the one publishing the game, so Bethesda being associated with the game definitely drew some ire from fans. And the other issues that occurred over the years were still in the back of the minds of players and fans of the series. So the trailer definitely helped, but it didn't fix all the issues, as there were new issues that were still propping up, as well as previous issues. Can't exactly just move on from that very easily. So then the month before release, they decided to do a multiplayer beta. The initial worry from fans was that since they were doing a multiplayer beta, it made people start to think that id had made multiplayer mode the priority in development as opposed to the single player mode. So that was a red flag for a lot of fans. And then even then, the reception to the beta was pretty lukewarm, with many reviewers describing the experience more like a Halo or Call of Duty mix instead of a classic Doom or Quake multiplayer experience. And this was a massive problem because with id shouting from the rooftop since their E3 reveal that they were going back to their roots, they were going back to the origins and focusing on the original games for inspiration. When the public got their first hands-on experience, when it felt more like a modern shooter instead of a classic arena shooter, it basically was not doing a good job of instilling confidence for potential players that it was in fact going back to their roots, and felt like that wasn't completely genuine. So the last piece of toilet paper stuck to the bottom of Doom's shoe was the lack of review copies. Advertising is key in media and entertainment, and one of the most common sources of advertising is high review scores and critical acclaim. But on the other side of the coin, one of the most damaging things that can happen to a game is to have it get dragged through the mud in terms of review scores. Most studios, when they release a game, are at least, somewhat confident in the product that they release, and show this by giving copies out to certain reviewers to help get positive word out before the game comes out, in hopes of convincing potential customers that are on the fence. But again, other side of the coin, publishers that aren't very confident in their games and expect more of a negative response to the games, they tend to skip out on giving out early copies in hopes that people might make an impulse buy and actually get the game if there isn't a whole lot of information to go off of in the first place. Whereas, those ones who are on the fence about it would be more prone to skip out on a purchase if the reviews are negative. So with no reviewers getting any early copies, it was a really troubling sign to many that it was just the last horrible sign that they could be giving out for many people after a very troubled and very confusing development that spanned nearly a decade at that point. So, man, going through this, Doom had such a problematic development, literally up until the day of release. It is, you look at all these warning signs, it is every step, every ingredient that adds up to a shit show of a final product. It's a miracle that the game came out to be actually fantastic the way that it was. No last minute reviews is always a terrible idea. I shouldn't say always a terrible idea, but usually points in the direction of this is not something that you want to be a part of. But yeah, that's the Doom and how it took shape specifically. So now we're going to go into the next part where I start to talk about the games that came out around Doom's release. So I do this for a couple of different reasons. One, it is important to look at the landscape of gaming around the time of the game's release to see what was more or less in demand, what people wanted, or what publishers and developers thought that they wanted. Sorry. These games could potentially influence other games around the time period and what the flavor of the month type of game is, as well as it is important to know and take into account how much money each individual consumer has. You know, I would say on average, maybe the average consumer has $100 a year to spend on games. Again, the average consumer. So when it comes to a brand new game being $60, that's maybe 2 games a year. And not everyone plays just one type of game. I'm a huge fan of, you know, Nintendo Mario games, but I also love the shit out of Doom. So as a consumer, if I can only purchase 2 games a year, if you have a year that's stacked up like crazy against a ton of other major releases, it definitely gives a small window into the time frame of what that game was going up against. And also, a lot of people like to say that this, you know, gaming has been terrible for so and so many years. It's nice to look back on these windows to see what other games came out around the time of the release of other games and look at year by year basis to realize there really wasn't a whole lot of bad years in gaming. There's definitely some better than others, but pretty much every year has some pretty major releases. So Doom came out in July. I think it was July. So what I like to do with a game is look at the 6 months before a game's release and 6 months after its release and kind of see everything in there. So we get a full year. So for the 6 months leading up to the release of Doom, the only games that it really had as major competitors would be Tom Clancy's The Division and I would say Battleborn, mostly just because they are shooters, pretty much because they're shooters. Doom didn't really have a whole lot leading up to release in terms of competition, because there were a lot of pretty big titles, but not a whole lot of shooters actually, surprisingly. Well, if its release was in July, that actually makes a lot of sense because that would make it in January, and usually shooters, the major releases in shooters tend to come out in the later end of the year, so like November and December type of period. But in the terms of the 6 months leading up to the release of Doom, we had The Witness, Street Fighter V, Fire Emblem Fates, Black Desert Online was released in America. I totally forgot about that game. People were so hyped about that game originally. Firewatch came out. We had the first Layers of Fear game. XCOM 2 also came out. I thought that might be considered a competitor since it is a shooter, but it's a different type of shooter. Hitman 2016, the first episodes, when Hitman itself was rebooted into its new trilogy. Hitman 3 actually just came out this past week. When Hitman was rebooted, it was episodic, the first one, and the first episodes came out the 6 months leading up to Doom 2016. We had Salt and Sanctuary came out. Everyone's favorite fighting game, Pokken Tournament, came out on the Wii U. Hyper Light Drifter, Enter the Gungeon came out. Dark Souls 3, which could kind of be seen almost as a competitor just because of the similar atmosphere. As well. Nope, Dark Souls was the last one. Actually, I put Battleborn in here twice. Battleborn, now there's a game I totally forgot. Yeah, Battleborn, is that Hi-Rez, I think? Yeah, Hi-Rez is just one of those studios that I always... Hi-Rez is one of those studios that I just throws up a red flag for me immediately. When I see Hi-Rez is making a game, always skeptical of it. So as for the 6 months that followed Doom's release, we had the release of Overwatch, huge game. Battlefield 1, which I still am very confused. Oh, because it was World War 1, wasn't it? Is that why they called it Battlefield 1? This is even worse. This is even fucking worse. Because, like... Battlefield 1, because like I'll look up like God of War, like I was looking because I actually referenced God of War later in the discussion, but I went to look up a certain scene from God of War 1, a certain boss fight, so I typed in God of War 1 and that's how I was able to find it. When it comes to fucking Battlefield, in this case, this one's called Battlefield 1, but if I'm trying to look from the original fucking Battlefield, that makes it more difficult. Stop it, developers, for the love of God. Anyway, other games that came out after Doom were Titanfall 2, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, as well as Modern Warfare 1 Remastered. So it was actually a pretty heavy year of shooters in the couple months that came out afterwards. Granted, Call of Duty comes out every single year. Titanfall was a big one, though. Battlefield games don't come out every single year, so that could definitely draw attention. Overwatch being a Blizzard game, always something to consider as competition, especially considering this was a shooter that they were making. And then also Modern Warfare 1 Remastered, which is what a lot of people consider to be kind of the turning point for Call of Duty games, where I'm not even going to get into that discussion, but Modern Warfare 1 was very beloved. So Doom had some pretty stiff competition at the later end of the year in terms of shooters, not so much the months leading up to it. And there were some other games that they had to deal with as well, because there might not be direct competition, but again, people have a set budget amount they can spend every year. And then after the release of Doom, for the 6 months after, they had to deal with competing with Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Dead by Daylight launched in 2016. That was wild to find out. Mighty Number 9 took the world by storm. Zero Escape, Zero Time Dilemma came out. Inside came out, which, God, I did not realize that game was 4 years old as well. Fury came out. Freaking Persona 5. No Man's Sky. Took a little while for it to become what it is today, but there was a lot of hype behind that game originally. Darkest Dungeon came out. We had Paper Mario Color Splash. Gears of War 4. I wasn't sure if I should consider this a competitor or not, because while it is a shooter, it is a third-person cover-based shooter. We had the Mad Max game came out. Civilization 6 came out. Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2, as well as Dishonored. 2016 had some pretty big fucking games in there. When you look at it, man. Some really good games in 2016. The Witness, XCOM 2, the first Hitman games, Pokken Tournament. That's not a meme. I do think it's a great game. Dark Souls 3, Enter the Gungeon, Assault and Sanctuary, Dead by Daylight, Zero Time Dilemma, Inside, which I've heard is good. Still not played it myself. Persona 5, Darkest Dungeon, Dishonored 2. 2016 was a pretty packed year. Imagine competing with Mighty Number 9. I know many. I think I'm pretty sure Blizzard pushed back their release date of Overwatch because they didn't want to compete with Mighty Number 9. I may be wrong about that. I don't think they officially said that was the reason, but everyone knows that's the truth. Battleborn was Gearbox, so that's Borderlands. I think Gearbox is Borderlands, correct? All right. So now we can finally slide into talking about Doom itself, the final product. Very, very tumultuous, very, very problematic development period. But the game itself was fantastic once the public finally got their hands on it. So let's start talking about the different aspects of Doom 2016. It is Borderlands Gold. So one of the important things when it came to Doom 2016 was that it was staying true to the original game itself. With Doom 2016, when it was officially announced to the public at E3 in 2015, they were very upfront and very early on that said the game was centered around three things. It was centered around badass demons, big fucking guns, and moving really, really fast. Doom 2016 was not a sequel, but it was a reboot for the Doom series. And that means they would have to figure out how to bring the series to modern times and be able to compete with modern shooters while still remaining to the series roots themselves. And at one time, this was a interesting issue that they had, and at one point they reached out the guys that had reached out to Todd Howard of Bethesda to ask him how he worked through this same problem that he had with the Fallout series, because again, as I said before, Bethesda makes the Fallout series, but they did not make the first games originally. They took over Bethesda. The first Fallout game that Bethesda themselves made was Fallout 3, so they went to him and asked him for help for how he was able to he gave them advice on how Bethesda worked through those issues when making Fallout games. Unfortunately, I could not find any quotes or anything that he had said, but worth noting. But sticking with these three main core principles, Doom was able to mesh the new and the old together very, very well. So the first thing one of the big core principles was fast action gunplay. The team emphasized movement as a huge part of the game in a myriad of different ways. So they made it so the only consistent way to gain health was to glory kill enemies. That means the player can't hunker down and wait in place to pick off some enemies until the encounter and the fight is over. They are forced to go out into the combat zone and fight back to get that health. They made it so that the player themselves is faster than can outrun most enemies. So if the player has the health or not, it's never a better idea to sit in place, because they are faster than almost all the demons out there and can try getting into a new position that's more beneficial to the one they're at right now. And even the ones that are faster than the Doomslayer can't keep up with the player if the player is using vertical mobility to their advantage by climbing up on ledges and keeping moving that way. Another thing that I found was really wild. I did not realize this originally, but Imp AI will actually break off and flank around the player a lot to try and surround them and pinch in on them as much as possible, and put them in compromising positions. The only way to effectively prevent this is to keep on the move before the imps can actually get around into the positions to fuck you over properly. All of this combines together to build a philosophy that the team called push forward combat. And it basically means that the player always has to be moving and moving towards the action. The player can no longer stay in place, and the more time that they do it, the more time it gives the demons to get into better positions. So one way to put it is to kind of look at it as a slider, whereas we'll say on the left side, if the slider's on the left side, then it's more beneficial to the player, and if it's on the right side, it's more beneficial to the demons. As the player stops moving and stays in place, the slider starts moving more to the right, and as the player is moving themselves, it slides more to the left. So movement is just so very important, because as you stay in place, it allows the demons to get in better positions, and it's just never good for the player. Always keep moving, and they did a really good job of building the game around this way as much as possible. So even the arenas in the game are built to give the player incentives to keep moving. The arena spaces are built to not give clear lines of sight from many different directions. If you look at this image, I took a screenshot from the game. You can see there is different rocks that are in the way to break line of sight. There is floating rocks. There's different levels of elevation. You are standing up and you can look down. You can see there's a height elevation. There's another ledge on the other side. You can also see a cave on the right side, and from this image here you can see the other side of the cave on the left side, and you can see just all the different ways that they constantly break line of sight in all of these different arenas. But they want to make sure there was no clear line of sight at any point for the demons to see you at all points in time, because they thought it'd be frustrating to have every enemy being able to shoot at the player at all times while you're just trying to take out one enemy. So the frequent broken lines of sights emphasizes a sort of drive-by shooting technique, where the idea was to just keep running around the arena until an opportunity presents itself to hone in on one lone straggling demon that's been separated from the group, move in and finish them off again, and then go back on the move again. But again, if the player spends too long in one place trying to take out that one demon, the rest of the herd will close in on them soon enough and likely kill the player. So it's about constantly moving, looking for one opportunity where someone's standing out, go in, try and kill them, or at least put some bullets into them, and then keep on the move again as quickly as possible. The guns themselves were meant to be very quick and responsive, just like the movement was. In an interview with Game Informer, Marty Stratton said that he didn't like the idea of hearing a gun click when a clip is empty, or having to stop and disengage from the enemy because you have to do this big prolonged reload animation. These types of things just didn't feel like they belonged in a Doom game, he said. And Doom was about pressing a button and getting an immediate response. So they wanted everything in the game to be as fluid and seamless as possible, so the flow of combat would never really be broken. Stuff like this is also why they implemented a weapon wheel into the game. It's become a standard in modern day shooters nowadays, and allows players to briefly slow down time and swap to a different weapon at will. at will, and the guns were placed in consistent places on the weapon wheel from start to finish. They would not change, so when fully mastered, muscle memory would allow a pretty much near instant weapon swap. So with harder encounters, with more varied enemies that require different solutions and different weapons to use, the flow would basically be seamless as the weapon swaps would occur. And the other thing was the glory kills. They were built into the combat the principle of moving very fast all the time and quick, seamless, fluid gunplay. Even though they were meant to be a means of, visceral satisfaction for the player, a payoff for their efforts to lay pressure on the demons effectively, they were also meant to be the player's only consistent form of healing and their only reliable method of healing throughout the entire game. They were designed to be extremely quick executions so that the player could finish off the demon and get right back into the action without really losing any momentum during it. So they did just fantastic job all around when you really look at all the different ways they've made it so that it would have very fast gunplay. So next thing we'll talk about is the story in Doom. So Doom as a whole has never really been a series that put a priority on its story. The only game that really did this was Doom 3, and it is by far the most mixed in terms of reviews and reception for a Doom game. With Doom 2016 and how much of its design philosophy revolved around staying true to the roots, the question came what to do with the story in that case. Do they continue following through with Doom 1 and 2 where they put almost no resources into the story, or is it something that they try to focus on modernizing along with other aspects of the game itself? So gameplay was decided to be the number one priority for the game, and the story was actually the last thing to be finished in Doom 2016. In the no clip documentary that I talked about earlier, the one about Doom 2016 development, Hugo Martin, who was one of the game's directors, he said he was talking about how the team's hair was basically on fire as the game's deadline was very rapidly approaching, and the story still made absolutely no sense. When asked how much time was left on the project when it all finally started coming together, Martin said, "It'll make us seem irresponsible if I told you how much time was left on the project." But all the levels were made, all the secrets were placed, all the glory kills and combat was balanced. At this point, it was just trying to figure out how they were going to tie a story to all of it. They were trying to figure out how they would explain that, why the character hates demons and why the demons are there in the first place and things like that. Maybe why the character was there. And Hugo Martin talked with GamesBeat at Games Lab 2016. This is an event that took place in Barcelona, and he gave some insight to how they approach story with Doom. This was really cool. When it came to storytelling in Doom, the team was very heavily influenced by a painting by an artist. The artist's name was Frank Frazetta, and the painting was called The Death Dealer. Now, this is a very, very important painting. Most of Frazetta's artwork have important parts lost in shadow. The general feeling of the painting is rendered out, but the important distinct features in pretty much all of his paintings are usually obscured by shadow. And The Death Dealer is a very famous piece, very famous fantasy piece of art that's been used for inspiration for tons of different content over the years. This painting alone has been turned into comic books. It has been turned into toy lines. It has been turned into statues. It has been turned into full books. It's been turned into D&D campaigns. It's been turned into album covers. This thing has been wildly inspirational for tons of different outlets over the years. And the interesting thing about this painting, though, is it lacks the detail in the most defining part of most artwork, and that would be the face. It just has dark red glowing eyes there. And the power of the audience's imagination who've looked at this artwork allowed the image to stay stuck in their mind and allowed them to flesh it out and adapt stories to the artwork based on how they interpret what's going on behind the shadows. And Hugo Martin thinks this is what makes Frazetta's paintings so compelling, is that the viewer fills in the gaps for so many minor details and things. Leaving out certain details intentionally can make really compelling imagery. So why can't the same principle be used for gaming, he thought. I know it's so creepy, but I love it. It's such a cool painting. So they eventually decided on a more hands-off approach to the story. There wasn't going to be, there wasn't any kind of real message that they wanted to put out there. You know, a lot of different games, you know, are about, you know, the stories or how to approach being a parent, or the importance of friendship, or needing other people in your life to lean on them, you know, and the point of the game is to give a story or an example that really emphasizes that. They didn't have any kind of message that they wanted to say with the Doom game. They instead decided to have a lot of the story focus on finding out more about who Doom Guy is and why he is in the Doom universe, because it isn't an accident he's there, and they really wanted to tell the story about how and why he ended up where he is. So, while gameplay elements and level design was taken almost entirely from Doom 1, Doom 3 heavily influenced the aesthetic and environment direction for the UAC buildings. They also used the story from Doom 3 to really build upon and really stack the deck with the idea that the UAC is this evil corporation, this evil company, because, you know, the UAC existed in the first two games, but they were just kind of a company that existed. They didn't have any kind of agenda or anything like that. It was only in Doom 3, when that finally came about, that they started to realize that maybe this company is evil, that they're not good, and they really leaned into that a lot when it came to Doom 2016. I love these little monologues, but talking over talking doesn't work that well. So the storytelling decisions of Doom 2016, the delivery as well as the tone, was very heavily influenced by a very odd source, a 1991 movie called The Last Boy Scout. For brief backstory, The Last Boy Scout is a 1991 buddy action comedy film with Bruce Willis, and it was beyond cliche at this point when the movie came out, because of the success of different movies like Lethal Weapon and Die Hard. The movie's script was built on the consciousness of the fact that everything about it was so cliche, so they took it and just made it into a fun movie that didn't take itself too seriously, and because of that, it made the film a lot more enjoyable. As an example, at one point in the movie, when Bruce Willis meets the bad guy says, "Can we do a formal introduction?" And Bruce Willis responds with, "Who gives a fuck? You're the bad guy, right?" And the other guy responds with, "Yeah, I'm the bad guy." And Bruce Willis says, "I'm supposed to be trembling with fear," something like that. "I'll start trembling in a minute." All this content dialogue was so on the nose, and it's what made it so enjoyable for a lot of different people. See, there you go. You know, it's just like, great movie. So when they finally started writing the story for the game, they decided, why not just write it with the idea that everybody already knows? A lot of people, I think, expected to go into Doom expecting the game to hint at what was the cause of everything. So maybe they would, maybe it was a cult that was in charge of everything, and there's a big secret that only a few higher up members in the cult actually know the story behind it. Or maybe everything that's going on is insinuated. Maybe it's like a virus or a plague or some kind of sickness outbreak at some point, and then it's revealed, oh my gosh, they were wrong all along. It's not a plague, they're actually demons. And the team made the call instead of trying to lead up to a big reveal of demons, they said, fuck that, let's just have the player, take control of the Doom guy, and when he walks out, they'll have announcements on the PA system saying, we need more volunteers to be turned into demons. When this idea was originally pitched by the team, they pitched the idea that the cult was just so out and about being so crazy and proud of them being a cult, but still being unaware of just how batshit insane they really are. I was playing through, and I had a perfect example of a screenshot where, when you're going around, they have the different holograms that are giving the different announcements, and one of them says, volunteers are currently needed for UAC's exciting to Revenant research program. Expand your potential, experience something new, and go beyond mere mortal limitations. See Jessica in Human Resources to find out if you qualify. Just absolutely batshit insane, where they are so immersed in it and absorbed in the cult that they're living in, but they just don't quite realize how absolutely crazy they are. They also gave scenarios and examples of maybe they would be board meetings to discuss who will be offered up as sacrifices to summon the gods, or who will donate their heart to summon the next Baron. And in the final game, there are actually they actually show some of stuff like this, because in some of the rooms they have monitors that show possession reports and things like that. So not only was this part of the pitching process, but also made it into the final release version of the game. So a QAnon, yes. Pretty much. That's just how cults are, man. Cults are Tiny has like experiences, because growing up her parents were like members of cults as well, so like she's told me some stuff, and we've watched that documentary on Nexium, and like cults are some crazy shit, man. They really are. They don't realize, cults just don't realize, people who are members of cults don't realize how batshit insane they are, because it's just, that's how their life, it's completely warped their perception of reality. And you look at the stuff that they're having in the game, and you go, wow, these people are batshit crazy. This would never happen. Don't be so sure. People can be manipulated and convinced to some pretty crazy stuff. They have delicious Kool-Aid. What's up, Treble? So they decided from the start that they knew everyone who played the game, they knew what to expect when playing the game. So when they made that decision that everyone would know what to expect, it was time to go back and redesign the start of the game and the very first level. So when it comes to the first level in video games, the first 5 minutes are really, really important, as it's crucial to grab the attention of the player. There's lots of different ways to get their attention, and I think it's broken down into 3. I feel like I'm forgetting one main group, but I think there's 3 main ways that tend to draw players in the first 5 minutes. So the first one is spectacle. This is something that's like a massive, beautiful, gorgeous cutscene, something that just is awe-inspiring and you just want to see more of it. One example of this is the original Final Fantasy VII. The intro cutscene, you look at it, go look at it on YouTube. It's the original Final Fantasy VII that came out, I think, in 1997. You look at it now, it's fucking laughable. But at that time when it came out, people's minds were fucking blown. I think, if I remember correctly, part of the reason that cutscene was the way it was almost out of spite. Because up until that point, Final Fantasy was a series that was exclusively on Nintendo. And when Nintendo moved to the Nintendo 64 and they did not adopt discs, they stuck with the cartridge-based system. Square was not happy about this, so they went to Sony. And I believe partially out of spite to show Nintendo what they missed out on, they really just pushed so hard to make this intro cutscene just absolutely gorgeous. And it is in part of the reason I learned recently that Final Fantasy VII was the game that broke down the barrier of JRPGs in the Western world. JRPGs were really not all that popular. They did not have a big installation base in the United States, and Final Fantasy VII was the first one to do it. So part of it was this grandiose, huge, this beautiful cutscene. So Final Fantasy VII is an example of one of those games that uses spectacle in the first 5 minutes. What's up, Stairmaster? It was? I thought so. Yep. Like I consider Scientology? Yeah. Yep. What type of cults? Like extremist cults or more normal cults? I'm sorry to ask about that. I mean, when it comes to cults, I'm sure there's lots of different specific classifications to it, but in general, cults are very, very similar in how they function, with getting people drawn into actually playing the game, to being a part of them. So another huge one that is, I didn't mean to fast forward yet. Well, you guys got spoilers for the next thing I'm talking about. The next category alongside spectacle to draw people's attention to the first 5 minutes of the game is curiosity. This is usually something that's just something happens that's so unexplainable, it's so wild, it's so confusing that you just look in and you go, what the fuck just happened? I need someone to tell me the specifics of what happened. And so the player will play through the game just so they can finally find out what ends up happening to explain what the hell they saw at the beginning. A good example of this would be Death Stranding. Then again, it could be kind of cheating to refer to Kojima for anything when it comes to Curiosity. But Death Stranding, I mean, you look at the intro cutscene. The first 3 minutes has, a man with some very interesting technology strapped to him on a bike as he starts riding away from rain that looks like normal rain, and once it hits birds, they fall to the ground, start shaking and freaking out, and then they get this white weird substance that starts sprouting out from them. And then as the man bikes away, you see these weird handprints start to embed themselves from an invisible force in the mud, and it creates this black sludge that comes afterwards. And that's just the first 2 minutes of the actual cutscene, let alone the first 20 minutes of gameplay. So and then there was also the whole advertising scheme. Curiosity is a very, very powerful motivator to get people to actually play through a game, to continue playing a game. Another good one that does this, in my opinion, is Danganronpa. Sorry, no memes. Danganronpa is a very good one for this. This is a game that in the first 5 minutes sets up a world where people who are the best at something, the absolute best at a certain specific skill, are recruited to a school. And when one of your main character ends up going to the school, upon stepping foot inside, basically it seems he's drugged. He wakes up in a classroom and sees that all the windows are bolted shut. There's cameras everywhere. And 15 other students also have lost their memories and wondering what the hell happened. And it's a very strong motivator where people go, what the fuck happened? Why are they locked in the school? And they want to find out the mystery themselves. So Curiosity is a extremely powerful motivator to continue people playing the game. The third one that I can think of is probably the most obvious one, and that's action. These are giving the player a fun, high-octane gameplay sequence that they can control at the very beginning to show them this is the type of game you will get to experience more of this as long as you continue playing through the game. So a good example of this is in the original God of War. There is the first 15 minutes is you are fighting your way through a sinking ship as you're avoiding a giant hydra that's trying to kill you. And then you finally actually fight the hydra, this giant beast, this giant sea serpent, as it attacks you, and you take it down. And it's a fantastic beginning and start to the game to show you what kind of content you will get if you continue playing this game. Another game that does this very well is Metroid. Super Metroid specifically has the very beginning where you do some basic platforming elements, and after a couple minutes you have a intense boss fight with Ridley, this giant space dragon pirate, who after the intense fight you then realize that there's a self-destruct countdown timer going and you need to escape back through the area you came against the clock. And once you get onto your ship, you realize the entire planet blows up, and I mean within the first 10 minutes 15 minutes of gameplay you have an entire planet blow up. Kind of hard to beat that in terms of action. So when it comes to the first 5 minutes of a game, the first 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes of a game, it's really important to draw the player in and keep their attention. And it's usually a time where you should show the player what to expect when they continue playing the game. How developers choose to do this varies, again, based on the experience that they're trying to create in the game. And Hugo Martin compared this part of game development similar to how movies have 15 minutes to establish a world for viewers. When it comes to audiences, they are apparently very, very receptive to the first 15 minutes of a movie, where they will be more than happy to go into any type of world that the director wants to take them to. They are very receptive, and it's the director's job to set up the rules of the world that it takes place in. They decided to use this same principle to set up the expectations of the world of Doom and what type of gameplay to expect, what the atmosphere of the game is going to be like, and any other elements, like how the story itself is delivered. And since they knew that Doom was going to be an action-based game, they had to make the very beginning of the game very heavily action-based. Originally, the first segment of the game went through very many reworks, as most games do. And one of these had Olivia. She would lecture the Doomslayer while he was strapped into a chair. There was the very typical basic man, a voice, disembodied voice, telling you exactly how all the different weapons work and how to use them. And the team knew that if if players' first interactions with the game was a very long tutorial or very long dialogue sequence, dumping rules and lore, it would set up the players would expect a different type of game for the rest of the experience. So they start off the game with you holding a gun and shooting within 20 seconds of the game starting. If you actually go back and play the game, and you press start game, they do a short, like 10 seconds or 20-second like cutscene where it shows the insignia coming in with that deep, dark, demonic voice, reading off one of his short incantation type things. And once that stops, the Doomslayer opens his eyes, and from that point on, within 20 seconds, the Doomslayer wakes up, breaks free of his prison, takes the demon's head, smashes on the table, stands up, puts a gun in your hand, you're immediately shooting within 20 seconds. It's freaking awesome. So they immediately jumped into the type of gameplay that the rest of the game was based around. And as for the story, they knew that most players weren't really playing for the story, and the devs wanted the players to know that the devs understood that. After the player puts on their Doomslayer suit, Dr. Hayden is first introduced with dialogue through a monitor where he tries to start this long conversation with the Doomslayer, trying to convince him to come to his side and do what he tells him to. The Doom guy immediately responds by taking the device that Hayden is speaking to him through and immediately throwing it to the side, ignoring what Dr. Hayden had to say. This was meant to symbolize to the players that the devs are taking the story and throwing it inside in preference for more gunplay and action. And they thought that this action was exactly what a lot of the core audience would have wanted to do if they were in that same position where a player tried to dump a bunch of story. They would want to just set it aside. So it was supposed to be a kind of like dialogue between the developers and the players themselves. Like, listen, we understand what you want to get to. This is us showing you we understand that. And then when it comes to story, one of the last things that's done that was done and is something that takes a ton of time to make and is what most people would argue is the most expendable part of any kind of story, or sorry, the most expendable part of Doom itself would be the codex that they made. The idea of implementing a codex came from primarily two places. Hugo Martin's love for nerd Bibles, as well as the inclusion of a cult for one of the forces in the game. So Hugo Martin, before coming over to id Software, worked in movies. Things like The Last Boy Scout and the 15-Minute Principle are examples of just how much he took over from movies and brought it over to game development. And he created concept art for Pacific Rim before he worked at id. And he cited how much he loved the passion the fan base had for fleshing out any and all facts and details about the world that they could. Things like what type of metal certain mech suits were made of, or who was the creator of certain engines for certain mech suits and things like that. He also cited how the Gundam fan base is just chock full of that stuff. And he said he loved how with some universes you can just completely immerse yourself in a sea of information, learning just the most benign information, not significant to the actual story, just for the sake of it. So he wanted to include something similar for Doom 2016 itself. Hi, Cairo. The other motivating factor was the inclusion of the cult as the antagonistic force, and a cult from the outside tends to be look pretty plain Jane and pretty inconspicuous. I mean, cults don't advertise themselves as cults. From the outside looking in to try to get people in, they try to look as normal and basic and unassuming as possible. It's only once you get to the higher levels of a cult do you really start to realize all the crazy shit that's going on in there. And with the codex entries and the information you get, it was supposed to follow the same thing, where when you get the first codex entries, you would get these very sterile, corporate, clean, direct, normal, basic entries on the demons. But then as you got to the higher levels of the codex, just like when you get to higher levels of cults, you learn the crazy shit. The idea was with the codex, you would also continue to learn the crazy shit and the crazy information that would be known about them. It's like a pyramid scheme, pretty much. Obviously, no one advertises anything as a pyramid scheme. You have to convince them that it's just any other normal, typical thing. Same thing with cults. Yeah, they can't just exactly draw people in by going, "Hey, you want to join our cult?" Like, no one's gonna fucking do it. All right, we have been going for an hour 45. I'm gonna take a short break. I'm gonna get some tea because I can feel my throat getting just a little bit sore because I've been talking like nonstop for almost 2 hours. We'll take a short break for about 10 minutes. I'm probably also gonna heat up some food because I made some meatballs. Make a meatball sub for me, and I will be back in a little bit. I hope you guys are enjoying this discussion. We will be back. Sit tight. That's actually such a perfect emo for that. Do I have that? I don't remember if I got that or not. I did get it. Okay, cool. I remember when that was happening, I was like, I don't know if I actually got it when I was in the stream or not. Hey, what's up, Yonder? I love the music in this game so much, and I'm also very excited to get to the point where we discuss the music design in this game because it's fucking cool, man. Mick Gordon's a legend. He's a fucking genius. For sure. Alright. Let us continue where we last left off, shall we? Borderlands 3, correct? Okay. So last thing we talked about was the story in Doom, how they presented the story. How the game came to their decision to do lean storytelling. And they didn't take it too seriously. So now we're going to talk about the art style and design of the game. So starting off, speaking with Game Informer in January of 2016, the team talked about how they had to decide how they wanted to do the art style for the game. And the options were to go with a style more similar to Doom 3 and the modern Wolfenstein games. Or if they go with Doom 1 and Doom 2. So Doom 3 was criticized for many different reasons, but at the time of its release, it was considered absolutely gorgeous. They went above and beyond to create rooms that were just so meticulously built. They made sure to build every pipe individually so that they didn't just hang lazily. They wanted them to flow in a way that made sense. They very beautifully handcrafted levels. As with Doom 1 and Doom 2, it was a style that a lot of people associated with the Doom IP, and it hadn't been brought to modern times with modern technology. But the issue when it comes to making older games and making them modern is that with older games, there's a lot less detail, and it's very people fill in with their imaginations what that lack of detail had in it, and everyone basically pictures and imagines it different, so it can be hard to make everyone happy when they do bring it to modern times. So even though that was considered, the team decided to go with Doom 1 and Doom 2. They made the art similar to Doom 1 and Doom 2. And they used rock and roll and lots of heavy metal as a strong inspiration for the aesthetic and design of the game. And they specifically mentioned how the members of the team interpreted the worlds of Doom 1 and Doom 2. They interpret it as looking like the type of artwork that you would find doodled on the back of like some 15-year-old's, notebook in math class. And it's so funny because that's such a specific description, and it's so poignant and descriptive in my head, but I just can't find the right search terms to give examples of that type of stuff. Also, best fucking song in this game. I love it. But the team did want to go with that type of art style. They wanted something that was very over the top. They wanted something with a ton of different skulls. They wanted to have the chains all over the place. They basically wanted to have it be very similar to Castle Grayskull from, I think, He-Man, if I remember correctly. And all of this was basically how they interpreted Doom 2 to look. When creating the entire experience for the game, including, the arts, the locations, the enemies, the weapons, the story, all of that stuff, they were shooting for what they call popcorn horror. Something that's very grotesque and extreme, something that's monstrous and gory and evil, but they didn't want the players to actually be scared at all. They didn't want them recoiling back in fear as to what was happening on screen. They wanted them to be having fun with this big doofy grin on their big smile on their face the entire time that they're doing it. And I'm trying to remember who it was. I always get their names. There's Marty Stratton. Oh my god, there's two members on the team, and I always get their damn names backwards all the time. And it's Hugo Martin, that's what it was. There's Marty Stratton and Hugo Martin. They both have Martin in their names, but Hugo Martin said in an interview that he's like, I'll let you know a little secret. This type of popcorn horror style that we go for the game is why we're able to get away with the levels of gore and gruesomeness that we do, because it's all in good fun, because it is just so ridiculous and so over the top that it's not seen as being something that's just very dark. It is seen as something that's entertaining and as a joke almost. So the popcorn horror was part for the atmosphere so that people wouldn't be scared. They wanted them to have fun, but they also allowed them to go above and beyond with the, you know, extremeness of it to the point that it was almost comical. So while the story of Doom isn't something overly important to the game, the team still tried to build a world in a way that, you know, gave it some sense of believability and realism to it. So when building UAC areas in the game, in order to create these enormous, massive facilities on Mars, the UAC had to believably seem like this massive mega corporation that was able to make all of this even possible in the first place. So the team had a very heavy emphasis on the industrial design for some of the levels in the game. They had areas that looked like it was doing a type of mineral processing. They wanted to make it seem like these areas were the underbelly of the corporation. They wanted to make the industrial areas have these really harsh working conditions and look like these would just be horribly dangerous places to work in. They even went so far to emphasize the fact that it is like the underbelly, that it is, you know, like just this lower sub-level of the company itself, that they use bones as an inspiration when making certain areas to make it feel like you were inside the carcass of a creature, with these massive metal braces that were placed on some ceilings in a way to make them actually look like ribs. Effectively, these industrial sections, these foundry sections of the game, served a couple of major purposes. One of them was varied environments. Instead of every level just being located in hell, or every level being located in some high-tech military base, it allowed levels to take place in a new setting that still fit the atmosphere of Doom. They had, like, you know, desolate, unforgiving landscapes on the undeveloped surface of Mars, and then these hostile, dark conditions of the industrial processing area. The other big purpose that this served was, again, to add to the believability, as I talked about briefly before. Again, a very small percentage of players played Doom for the story, but for the ones who did pay attention, a company that was running an industrial complex of this sheer size, it makes it seem believable that, you know, this company would be the only ones capable of setting this up in the first place. The fact that it reaches this certain grand scale to an extent eventually wraps in on itself to make it more believable that in order to build something this big, it only makes sense that a company would be able to do this in the first place if they can manage all this. And again, it further built up the idea that the UAC was the mega corporation that it was. And then in contrast with the industrial areas, you have the corporate headquarters areas, and Marty Strand described these areas as almost a pseudo-utopian corporate facility. They are very modern, they're very scientific looking, they're very clean and pristine looking, you know, underneath all the fresh blood painted everywhere by the recent demon invasion. But the team had a very interesting decision that they had to make when building these research areas. In most sci-fi in most sci-fi entertainment, when you create the science lab, the science research types of areas, those are the areas you tend to go overboard with visually to really emphasize how futuristic and technologically advanced the location, the time period is. But they actually dialed it back in these sections when it came to Doom 2016, because the industrial area is where all the hard work is done, the manual labor, the processing, and therefore they already have a lot of technology and they have a lot of screens and a lot of different interfaces in these different areas. So they wanted to make the two areas contrast more visually, because they thought screens and futuristic tech everywhere for these two different sections would get really repetitive and boring. So while the corporate headquarters area is much, you know, brighter, it's more clean, they are much more minimalistic, and they have less monitor, screen, and hologram heavy in these areas. Things that you would, you know, expect in any other type of media that would take place in this type of environment. So And then the other area we have is the levels in Hell, and these were definitely a lot more straightforward and simple. They use skulls as a core element when they were designing these different areas. They have, the world is decorated in skulls all over the place. There are skull enemies. Areas are locked behind skulls, either by, the press switches where it's literally a skull there where you press it into place, or you grab keys that are just giant skulls and you place them into doorways to allow you to move forward. And then when you're traversing and walking through these areas, you're walking through the skulls of these titanically large creatures. And there's different locations in Hell. One of the places is called the Titan's Realm. Again, I love these dialogues, but it's just so difficult to talk over people talking. One of the locations that they do in Hell is called the Titan's Realm. And this location is littered with the leftover remnants of these skyscraper-sized behemoth demons. And these creatures that are just so large, it would make the player just wonder where the hell they could possibly be. What kind of place could they be in that these larger-than-life ancient creatures once lived here and eventually succumbed to death themselves? And what could be lurking around the corner that could have brought them to this point? So, that is the art direction that they decided to go with Doom, how they came to those decisions. And now we go to one of my favorite parts of Doom itself, and that will be the music of Doom. So the music in Doom was composed by none other than Mick Gordon. And are you guys ready to see what Mick Gordon looks like? The fucking heavy metal dude, the guy who's got like long fucking flowing luscious hair, covered in tattoos, and in like fucking ripped t-shirt. That's him. Very clean cut, very professional, very not what I was expecting when I found when I saw the guy who composed the music for this game. Daddy Mick, it's really funny too, because if you look at different interviews with him, he is very articulate, very well put together. Not that I didn't expect him to be, but I remember every time when I was researching the game, I wanted to research more about the music because I loved hearing what he had to say in all of his interviews. Excuse me. So, Mick Gordon is a musical god. Yeah, I was really surprised. I think he was didn't he get to start doing, if I remember correctly, Nickelodeon games? And now he's doing stuff like this, and he did Wolfenstein games. The man's got quite an extensive catalog and reach for tons of different genres, but the guy is fucking brilliant. I'm excited to talk about his creative process that he had for the music. So, Mick Gordon was the composer for the music in Doom 2016 and was tasked with bringing the music of Doom to the modern era while, again, just like the gameplay, still trying to stay true to the series' roots. And I really love Mick Gordon because for me and him, we are very much on the same wavelength when it comes to how we view the role of music in video games. So Gordon said that he believes the 90s has some of the best video game music the industry has ever created because a lot of it is really front and center. When you look at music and audio, music really hasn't evolved much with video games over the years when you compare it to other things. So yes, you can have higher quality audio in video games. You can have more music in video games, but it hasn't really evolved much compared to other things like the different control inputs that's over years, the visual fidelity increase, the size and scope of games. Tons of different aspects of gaming have really had these leaps and bounds when it comes to what you can do in video games. What has changed though with music in video games is in more recent years, music has become more part of the whole instead of its own standout part of the experience. And music now will blend in, and it's something you wouldn't really notice as much as it would be something atmospheric or build on top of the emotion that's happening on screen. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. This is not a bad thing. It serves its purpose. It all depends on how you do the game and what you're trying to get out of the game. But I definitely do agree that for the most part, music has definitely taken a back seat in more modern times when it comes to their role in the experience of the video game. Gordon points out that a lot of music in the 90s you knew very well and could sing or hum them front to back. With Doom 2016 being a reboot of a series from the 90s, he really wanted to pay tribute to that part of the game where the player should be aware of the music playing. It should be a payoff. It should be an emotional reward for the player doing what they're doing well, that the demons are scared of you, the player, and what you're doing, that you are succeeding in what the devs wanted you to do. So Gordon described the music in Doom as something that's aggressive, brutal, tactile, claustrophobic, and in your face. The music in Doom tries to capture the complete lack of restraint that you have while playing the game. The game itself is up close and personal. I mean, because you literally have like your hands down the throat of the demons sometimes. You're not hiding behind cover or trying to run away. That was the final end result, but to get to that point, it took a lot of time and discussion for them to come to that decision. In the documentary with no clip, as I've referenced multiple times throughout this discussion, Mick Gordon explains what he does when he first created a song in the video. So, one of the issues with video games is that they change constantly. But you obviously want to start working on music early enough that there's time to iterate and finish the music by the time, you know, the project is finished. And Gordon said that one of the first things he does when creating music for a game is to create a sort of universal language between the two parties, that being himself and the director, or, you know, whoever it is that he's speaking to. Because when someone says that they want music to be heavy, that can be a completely different when you ask, it can mean completely different things when you ask different people what they think of as heavy music. This sort of understanding is really, really important, because if there's any ambiguity between the two parties with this sorts of thing, it can cause massive issues, because of 2 years down the line, if there is any issues with the music and the game is finishing completion, there's very little time to correct the issue, and this creates a whole brand new bigger issue because you have such a short window to get this thing finished. Early on, when trying to establish what kind of sound they wanted for the game, it was very clear that they didn't want to create heavy metal. They didn't want it to be like heavy metal with a huge emphasis on guitars in the soundtrack. They said it would sound much too cliche, and they worried it would make Doom 2016 seem it was more like a Bill and Ted video game than Doom. So with that one major restriction set, Mick Gordon got to work on the music. He wanted to pay tribute to the source material, but he didn't want to tunnel vision too much on that. He said that if you start focusing too much on source material, you start doubting yourself anytime you put any kind of, and you start losing confidence anytime you do anything creative with it or deviate a little bit from what the original was. So he decided to take the actual word Doom and cross it out, kind of giving himself, in that sense, a second restriction: no heavy metal with guitars, and at that point, no, Doom. So then he started to think about all the other parts of the game and the major themes and settings and ideas and associations with the game, and really breaking down what each of them means. So he really started to think about hell. He started to think about demonic invasions. He started thinking about Mars and the isolation, and how all these things were being portrayed by the developers, and then started really thinking about all these components, what they really mean, not just to the devs, but to the players and other people as a whole, what they would think about all these different aspects and all these different themes. What does it mean to be scared of demons? What does it mean to be in hell and to be in a futuristic environment with an invasion going on? What does it mean to be the last human left alive on a planet? Things like that. And once all these pieces were analyzed, the two parties kind of came to a realization that you, the player, the demon slayer, was the enemy of the demons. Essentially, you were the boss fight for the demons themselves, which I think is such a fucking cool way to put it. But once they realized this, Gordon was able to start creating something more original for the soundtrack, while still basing it in the original roots of the original series. So once Gordon started to actually make music for the game, he used a lot of synthesizer sounds, and he changed them, and he would run them through different equipment that would make it sound angry and aggressive in an attempt to make them sort of fill the role that a guitar would fill in that same piece. And this sound would eventually be used in the game, primarily in the QuakeCon trailer footage that was shown, and to an extent it would also be used in the E3 footage. And the response for the general public was that it sounded pretty cool, but it just didn't quite sound like Doom. And so with this feedback, Mick Gordon decided to start incorporating guitar a little bit into the soundtrack, and it started to sound good. Gordon took the iconic riff from E1M1, the first level in the original Doom, and he played it, but he played it much lower. And just playing it at a much deeper sound just automatically made it sound much more aggressive. So he liked that, but he felt like he needed to go even lower. So he actually got a hold of a 9-string guitar, and he recreated the original sound while still incorporating the original 4 notes. So that's how he, like, it's almost like overkill whenever you speak to musicians, you talk about 9-string guitars. It's just so over the top and so unnecessary. And nope, that's what he needed to do to try to get the sound that he wanted for Doom. So he added more and more prominent guitar sounds onto the soundtrack. He described it as, like, 5% originally, and it sounded good, so they upped it to like 10 and 15%, and they kept upping it until they got to the point where it really sounded nice, and it ended up with the sound that we got for the final Doom soundtrack. Have a good night. Have a good day at work, Matthias. As for other instrumentation, Gordon had some very specific inspiration for the sound that he was going for. This is really cool. Gordon was really inspired by a piece of concept artwork that showed these massive monolithic structures that were fractured and broken to an extent that you could actually see the energy holding these pieces together. As you see in the artwork, there's that one long bone that's been broken into 3 pieces, and you could see the electricity, the energy holding it together. And Gordon really latched onto this, and he started to explore what this energy would sound like and how he could possibly incorporate this sound into the music. To get as close as possible to this idea, Gordon decided to break down sound to its most bare bone components, which he described as sine waves and noise. And he then fed different rhythms of sine waves and noise and fed them through various analog equipment. He would then use the equipment to mess with the pure sine waves and noise for a distorted, corrupted effect. When it comes to describing audio and sound in this creative design, it's like trying to explain color to a blind person. You could try to do it as best as you can, but it's really very different to actually, see it, just like it's very different to hear this. So I actually, while doing my research, I came across Mick Gordon's YouTube, and he has the couple videos where he talks about the development process for some of the music in Doom, and this one part really stood out to me. So I cut a 45-second hard at, and I'm gonna show it to you guys because it's absolutely so fucking fascinating. It's really, really cool. So take a look at this.
So the idea here wasn't to use the analog equipment as an effects processor, even though that's kind of what it's made for. Basically, I'm using the circuits of the equipment to corrupt the pure sine waves and noise.
You hear the distortion of the sound to add as a sound effect to the song. It's so fucking cool. I love it. You listen to it and you hear those weird distortion sound effects, and normally it would be one of those things where it's undesirable, but he specifically singles those sound effects out to try to draw. It's so good. It's so cool. I love it. The creative process is wild. Again, these are it fits so fucking well. These are that section is from a video on Mick Gordon's YouTube channel. Go watch them. He unfortunately has like 3 videos about the development of Doom music, and they're short videos. They're like 4-minute videos, so like absolutely go watch them. They're so fucking cool. And Mick, if you happen to see this, please make more. It's so goddamn cool. It's just my favorite song too. It's so good. So in Mick Gordon's search to create these very strange sounds, Gordon found a lot of really obscure and different equipment to get the sound effects that he ended up getting. He used an old reel-to-reel tape machine, an old cassette machine with a really crappy cassette tape. He found some old obscure guitar pedals and things like that, and they all had really varied and bizarre sound effects on the sound when he fed them through them. But the great thing about all of this is that the original inspiration the energy that holds the rocks together still made it through to the final game. If you go into the game and you go into sections in hell, you can actually see rocks that are held together with energy. It's not uncommon for concept art to excuse me. It's not uncommon for concept art to be just that, a concept that doesn't make it into the final game. It's not a finalized decision, it's just an idea. But thankfully, this idea that he latched on was something that made it into the final game. It still fits great and it still sounds fantastic, but it's nice to see that the origin of the idea for the music still exists in the final game itself. So with the sound starting to take form, Gordon himself had to create quite a bit of music, as there was a lot of very varied locations in the game. I lost my spot. Where did it go? Here we go. And the way he said that he was able to create a system to track this was he created a sort of pyramid hierarchy. So at the top of the pyramid, there was Doom. No matter what the song being made was, it had to sound like it belonged in a Doom game specifically. Below that, it was broken into 3 groups. You had the UAC, you had the industrial area, and you had hell. Because, you know, pretty much every section of the game takes place into one of these 3 different categories. And then the layer below that was all the individual scenarios themselves and encounters that you have in the game. And that they would specifically line up with different areas up above it. So for example, you have the Spider Mastermind boss, which was located in hell, but by design, it was a heavily industrial designed enemy. So the sound for that fight was built between those 2 categories in the hierarchy. So once this hierarchy was established, the team would then send Gordon gameplay footage of the game for him to look at. He would take the footage and take it into his gaming area, where he would get into the mental space as if he was, you know, normally playing the game himself. Even though, again, what was sent to him was just a video footage. It wasn't actual gameplay footage that he could play. So he would take it into a space where he normally plays games, and he would pull out a controller to help kind of further immerse himself in the idea that he was playing. And then he would try to imagine what it would feel like to play the game at that point, and try to figure out what kind of emotional response he would get and what type of music would complement the feeling of that response he was getting. He would then take his phone that was near him and had a metronome app on it, and he would start tapping on it to the beat that would match the feeling he had, to give him an idea of what the BPM was to make the music for that specific encounter. So at that point, Gordon would know what the music needed to do emotionally, what the tempo had to be, and where it was established in the hierarchy itself, where it fit in. And with all of this information, he would finally be able to create, to start making a song. And then it would, you know, be iterated on from there. But that was the actual process he did when creating all this music, and it was so wildly fascinating to see. Hi, Tiny. So we talked about the music, the story, the art direction, sticking to its roots, the gunplay. Now, the last thing to talk about is the remnants of Doom 4 itself. As discussed earlier, when Doom 2016 was Doom 4, Doom 4 was looking too much like your typical military shooter, and it didn't really fit the bill of a Doom game, as that's why it was called so kindly by the people working in secrecy, Call of Doom. You think that this meant that once the game itself was rebooted, that everything that was worked on up until that point would be scrapped? However, there was a couple things that were brought over from the original Doom game, from Doom 4, and one of them, what we do know of, is actually the glory kill system was something that was brought over from Doom 4. In version 1.0 of Doom 4, the enemy would have times where they would go up to the player and attack, and if the player melee attacked back at the right time, it would perform something called a sync melee animation, and this would cause an animation to play that had the 2 grapple for a short time, and it would then end in a cool enemy death. It was a very slow, really cinematic way for the player to kill the enemy. It was very visually rewarding, but it was slow. Shortly before they made the decision to reboot the game, the early versions of the glory kill system was presented, but even then, with the game where it was at, it was still considered too slow even for that game. So it was probably extremely slow. But eventually, after the reboot happened, the idea was represented, and according to Marty Stratton, the concept animatic that was shown eventually led to the idea of the push forward combat idea, as well as the initiation of the glory kill system in the game. And once this animatic was shown to Kevin Cloud, he said he actually it actually redefined first-person combat to him, and that it really helped reinvigorate him and re-energize him and motivate him again to work on the project. So it goes to show that even if a game is completely rebooted and start over from scratch because it just is not going in the right direction it needs to, you could still find different parts to reuse in a different project. So one of the last things I like to talk about, how many glory kills are there? That's a good question, because when you're glory killing an enemy, it depends on where you look specifically. If you are looking at their head, if you're looking at their foot, if you're looking at their arm, if you're approaching from the front, if you're approaching from the back, can change what glory kill animation you get. For example, I do know that the pinkies have 3 glory kills, but I think like the generic zombie dudes have like 4 or something, and then I think the Baron of Hell only has like 2. It really varies a ton. I don't know exactly how many unique glory kill animations there are, to be honest. Pretty sure the Cyber Demon only has 1, but this is the point where I start talking about what about the game was groundbreaking or influential. And at this point, the game doesn't have a whole lot that's necessarily groundbreaking. It's more about taking the old and bringing it back into the forefront and the light of the public and developers again, as something that is still mechanics and designs that people really enjoy. Nothing about it is necessarily groundbreaking. It's just blending old with the new, and it does it in a fantastic way. And the game is still relatively new, so it's kind of difficult to say what about it is necessarily influential. We don't know yet, but there is some things that we can guess and infer about how certain decisions in this game can influence future games, possibly. One of the big things is that single player games are still very much in demand. This seems like something that's very obvious, but it is still something that needs to be said from time to time. Multiplayer games have been pushed a ton with different developers and different publishers, with the single player sometimes as an afterthought, because the multiplayer is the thing that keeps people coming back or keeps them playing for the game for long extended periods of time. Doom did have a multiplayer mode, but the main focus and selling point was definitely the single player mode, and it was the thing that most people ended up picking the game up for in the first place. And Doom still sold pretty dang well, and Eternal sold even better apparently. And it might let publishers know that there's still a lot of money to be made on the single player game. I mean, we still have, if you looked at Cyberpunk recently had news that even after its all the returns counted and factored in, it still sold like over 10 million copies, and was one of the biggest launches of a digital sale game ever, and that's a single player game exclusively. So there's again, it's one of those things, it seems very obvious, but sometimes you just need to have examples thrown in their face to remind people. And Doom 2016 might also influence more studios and publishers to bring back dead but beloved IPs. Bringing back beloved IPs can be dangerous, but if done right, can tap into an existing installation base and will only build from there. It's great because you have the existing fan base who, if it ends up being just right and people are excited for it, then they get hyped up, and then they just start talking about it to other people as well, and it kind of just builds it from there. It's got all the new potential buyers who see it as a brand new game, and it has that new game smell and hype behind it. So it can be a little bit difficult. It can be a little bit risky to do properly, but when done right, pays off in dividends. So that is the analysis of Doom, the final product itself. Let's start talking about the reception of Doom. So what I like to do is I obviously, when it comes to number scores are not a good direct indicator of the quality of a game at all, but they are good generalized ideas, at a glance, ways to kind of get a gauge of what the public thought of a game. And I like to use Metacritic because they take all the scores and they aggregate it together to get an average score. Another important thing to note is that if a review does not give a number score, then what Metacritic does is they go look at their review and they assign a number score based on how they feel it should be given based on what the review said. And then they add that to the score to average it. So it's even a little bit less accurate, but still, I think there is value to be had when looking at Metacritic scores. So Doom got an average Metacritic score critically of 85. It got 85 on PlayStation 4 and PCs, and it got an 87 on Xbox. That actually is an average score of 86. I can read numbers well. This makes it tied for the 27th best game of 2016 alongside with 12 other games. The games it tied with were XCOM 2, The Witness, and Rocket League. More, but just to list a couple. And then the type of games it was beaten out by were games like Uncharted 4, Inside, Overwatch, Dark Souls 3, Axiom Verge, Titanfall 2, Dishonored 2, and Stardew Valley. So it did pretty damn good in terms of reception. As for the user score, it also got an 8.5. It got 8.4 on PlayStation 4, 8.5 on Xbox, and 8.5 on PC. So just looking at the actual number scores, the game was very well received. As for the public reception, the reception for the game was seen as just widely positive. All the warning signs that this game was exhibiting that it was going to be a terrible mess of a game turned out to actually not be true. The game was a beautiful mix of fast-paced action and gameplay like the originals, but was cleaned up with modern additions with things like a dedicated jump button, a weapon wheel, beautiful graphics, vertical aiming, and even a light RPG system. It was nominated for 26 different awards, and it won 11 of them, including Best Action Game of the Year, Best Music and Sound Design, Excellence in Gameplay. It won an award for its control precision, as well as a game for Classic Revival. So, game just was winning accolades left and right, very positively received by the public, critics, and fans alike. Now comes the part where I bitch again. Like earlier, remember when I was bitching about how games get remade and they take the same title as the original game? Now I get to bitch about sales. I cannot get a single accurate number for sales anywhere. According to a site called Steam Spy, by July of 2017, the game had sold 2 million copies. But as far as I can tell, the way Steam Spy tracks numbers, those numbers are based on how many people have the game in their Steam library. This can count for people who were gifted the game. These are games that were given out as free codes. These are, there is media accounts that automatically have access to every game on Steam so that they can play the game themselves. These are games that were obtained in bundles, things like that. These numbers are not very accurate, and this only counts for Steam. This does not count Xbox, PlayStation, or Switch. Bethesda themselves have not said any concrete information or numbers on Doom sales because no one is required to give their numbers out for sales, and I hate this. Sales are such an important data figure when it comes to analyzing and look at games. They do not tell the whole picture of a game, but they are very important for analysts, for journalists, and anyone interested in getting a better idea of the industry and possibly why certain decisions are made. Because when it comes down to it, video games, the industry is a business. The goal is to make money. That is the end of the end goal of any business that's creating and releasing a game. A game's ability or inability to make financial goals can give a lot of potential insight when it comes to why a series has made some drastically different decisions and course changes in their future games, or why there hasn't been an entry in quite some time. But I mean, at this point, I'm preaching to the choir because nothing's ever going to change about this. Because the only time that a company will ever share the sales numbers of a game is if it's something to benefit the company, and that's only what happens when the sales are really great. It would be asinine for a company to announce a game sold like shit. So it'll never happen. We can assume the game has sold over 2 million copies according to Steam. And we can assume the game did sell well, though, because we did get a sequel. Doom 2016 would eventually be followed by Doom Eternal. Eternal was first announced at E3 2018. And it would eventually come out to take over the world of memes when it was released on the same day as Animal Crossing New Horizons in March of 2020. On March 20th, 2020. But yeah, the reception, I mean, it was just glowing positivity all around it. People were very happy with the final product that they got, and the only point of contention with this game is the arguments between which is better, Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal. So now we are going to talk about what we can learn from Doom, what the industry can learn from Doom. When the first thing I think that we can learn is when it comes to bringing back a series from the annals of history, it's important to identify why it was loved specifically and build upon that. Doom 2016's design from the very start was about identifying what about Doom 1993 was about, and most importantly, what made it fun. It pinpointed three main components that were the foundation of any Doom experience and what made Doom Doom. That was the badass demons, the big fucking guns, and moving really, really fast. And because every decision about gameplay experience was building up or around one of these three main things, not only was the game concise and focused, but it was also true to the original. It felt like taking an old game and bringing it to modern times instead of bastardizing an old IP and bastardizing it into a modern game, indistinguishable from the rest, except for, you know, it having a skin of an older IP, a different game. So they did a great job of, finding specifically what made it great and building upon that. Really, really important. Let's see. It's another lesson that we can learn from Doom. It's important to take some lessons from modern games and apply it when it benefits the game. It's always important to honor traditions and, as stated before, identify what it is about an old game that made it fun. But things in gaming constantly change. Trends change. Advances are made. Standards evolve. Games are not the same that they were 10 years ago, for better or for worse. It's important to accept that fact. And it's important to accept the fact that games have to be modernized in some way, and that it's actually good for the game to do it in certain ways. Once this is understood, games and older games, you could basically take an older game that was great and make it truly amazing. Things like jumping, mantling, platforming, these are all things that didn't exist in the OG Doom game. There's like no music. That's just super quiet. Okay. Yep. Jumping, mantling, platforming, these are all things that did not exist in OG Doom games. A Doom game with platforming elements sounds absolutely terrible on paper, but that's if it's viewed through the lens of 1993 and how the game was built back then. In practice, the platforming movement made for much more hectic movement and much more chaotic and fun gunfights in the final result of Doom 2016. Glory kills. While this sounded like it would, when you hear about it, it sounds like something that fits really great into Doom for its gory aspect, but overall it sounded like it would also seem very out of place on paper because it's, you would assume that it would really mess up the pacing of the combat. And once tweaked and balanced for the pacing that the game was built upon, the glory kill system actually became the center of Doom's combat loop and forced players into adrenaline pumping skirmishes. What else? Oh yeah, restricted arena spaces. This was really cool too. Doom, the original one, was all about going fast. That meant getting to the levels, through the levels, as quick as possible for some people. They had a built-in speedrun kind of aspect with a timer. And in Doom 2016, what they did was they actually had arena spaces locking a player into a space until they cleared out the enemies. And that sounds very restrictive and controlling, but it allowed for, because they had this system set up, they could actually have wave-based combat that almost felt like a puzzle type of sequence where specific wave encounters would be done in consistent order and certain ways. Enemies would spawn in certain positions and locations to make it so that it would create these dynamic, very focused, articulated combat encounters in these different arenas. It sounds like something that locking the player into an area, they cannot move, they cannot progress until they beat these enemies, sounds unnecessarily restrictive, but it's something that ended up adding to the combat experience as a whole much better. Next lesson we can learn, it's also important to find out what about modern games would not benefit a game and trimming the fat from there. So things like rechargeable health, reloading weapons, and dozens of different weapons to choose from. These are all things that are very common in more modern games and more modern shooters, but this would also take away from the experience that Doom was built upon. health recharging would really incentivize hiding until healthy again, and that completely goes against the original design philosophy that they have from the beginning. Reloading weapons would really segment the gunplay for just the sake of adapting a mechanic that seems to be the standard in most other shooters. And then the issue of a plethora of weapons would means that enemies wouldn't have clear counters or weaknesses, and it would make the encounters and with enemies much more muddy instead of distinct. I like to think of it as if you had like almost like Dark Souls, where there's a lot of enemies. They can be killed in a plethora of different ways with all the different enemies, whereas with Doom and Doom Eternal more specifically, certain enemies have direct counters to it, and it makes the encounters feel much more distinct when fighting an enemy, as opposed to, you know, more generic and, you know, muddied. Another very important lesson is building on fan expectations is extremely important for the experience, because fans knew what they were getting when they got the game. It was able to make a story. They were able to present this story in a very specific way that they did, that if they had not identified the expectations of the player base, they might not have been able to do, or they might have been too scared to do, and we would have gotten a very different game. And so yeah, because fans want to Doom like the old ones, it was able to make a combat loop like they did. And the last lesson I think we can learn from this is that story and gameplay has its place in the industry, but pure fun gameplay does as well. Games that have this massive narrative and a lesson or a message or a story to tell obviously are totally fine. Games that have long cutscenes and long exposition dumps to present the information story, those games exist in the industry, and they are necessary in the industry. But when it comes to games that are just pure gameplay, those also are very, very necessary for the game. And even then, when a game does offer story in depth, they don't have to be done by exposition. There was tons and tons of world building and lore in Doom 2016. I mean, they even, like, if you go and look at the codex, they explain specifically why the Mancubus has the ability, basically has unlimited ammunition for its guns, stuff like that. As long as you offer the ability for players to find that sort of stuff, if they want it, they will seek it out. So that is the lessons that I think we can learn from it. Now, I kind of want to do something a little bit different. I kind of want to try to start doing this as well for all future discussions. I believe, hopefully, at some point, these design of play discussions will snowball or grow in recognition, and maybe more people will be a part of them. And I'm hoping at some point maybe it might get to the point where maybe certain devs hear about it and they go back to look at certain discussions that happen for their videos. And I hope that maybe at some point in the future they will watch the videos and get to the point where I want to do a thing where I ask devs questions about the game, and hopefully maybe at some point they would either contact me or leave answers for the questions in the comments. So yeah, this is gonna be a regular thing where at the end of a discussion I'm gonna have a couple questions that I thought of for the developers. So if anyone watching this right now on YouTube happens to be someone who was a developer or someone who worked for Doom who can answer some of these questions, that would be fantastic. The first question I had was, what was the reason for not having sent out the early copies originally? Was it a case where maybe you were unsure how the public would respond to the game and wanted to just play it safe to not have that first initial wave of people being unsure and maybe getting that bad publicity out there? Or was the people behind the game, were you guys fully confident in the product and you just wanted people to see for themselves instead of looking to reviews first? The second question that I had was, Doom 2016 has almost nothing in terms of new characters, but in Eternal you guys had a ton of new enemies to face, like the Whiplash, the Gargoyle, and the Carcass. Was there any reason you didn't bring any of these original characters to the first game, Doom 2016, or was it a case of once you saw the positive response to Doom 2016, it validated that you guys had a good grip on what people wanted out of the Doom IP, and it made it so you can confidently bring new demons into the series? And then the third question that I had was, what was the creation process for creating these new creatures? In the first game, you still created characters, but you had the starting points from previous games. With Eternal, you were creating new characters from scratch. How did that creative process exactly go? So those are the three questions I had. And lastly, the other thing that I really like to do is whenever I play through a game for the first time for these design and play discussions, I like to give my personal thoughts. Oops, I forgot to cycle this. I like to give my personal thoughts on my experience with the game so far, and my thoughts on Doom was it was fucking fantastic. This was my favorite Doom game that I played until I played Eternal. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal for me are like comparing it's comparable to say the like Paper Mario 64 and Paper Mario 1000 Year Door, where both of them in their own rights when played in a row are 10 out of 10 fantastic fucking games. They're a blast front to back, but once you play the sequel and see how they eventually iterate on the mechanics that were in the first one, going back to the first one is hard when you realize how much better it will become in the next one. And to be completely honest, I don't remember a whole lot of the specifics of Doom 16 that were exclusive to that game, partially because I loved Eternal and I played it and I loved it so much, and it's probably just taken all of my memory associated with the new Doom games with it. But it's also possibly because I played Eternal on Nightmare difficulty and therefore spent more time on it. Maybe it's just the most recent one that I played, so that's just more recent in my memory. But I do remember very clearly playing through Doom 2016 and just having a big smile on my face the entire game. The game was so fucking fun. For anyone who is interested in playing the game, absolutely play it. The game is only $20 on Steam and I think on Xbox as well. I don't know what it is on PlayStation. The game frequently goes on sale, especially on Steam for like $5. Keep an eye out for it. Definitely, absolutely play it. But like I said before, play the first one for the reasons I said before. They're both fantastic, but if you play Eternal first and then you go back and play the first one, I think that could negatively impact your experience that you would have while playing the normal game. But I think that's finally it. That's Doom 2016. So we're done with this. Thank you everyone for watching 10 episodes of Design to Play. Being with me for this time. It's kind of wild for the past like 3 months. I mean, I played Doom 1, Doom 2, Doom 3, Doom 64, Doom 2016, Doom Eternal, 6 Doom games. Back to back to back to back. I did tons of research on Doom 1993, tons of research on Doom 2016, read a book, an entire like biography book on the development of Doom, the original one. I watched the documentary on Doom 2016. I've been listening to fucking the Doom soundtrack all the time. It's gonna be like, I pretty much my whole life has been like consumed with like fucking id Software and Doom for the past like 3 months. It's gonna be kind of weird moving on to doing something different. Like I said before, I plan on at some point doing the Wolfenstein, the original Wolfenstein 3D, as well as Wolfenstein New Order, and I also would like to do Quake at some point, but I'm a little burned out. I love it. I love the games they've made. They've done a fantastic fucking job, but I need a bit of a break and do something a little different. So we'll get to those games eventually, but probably not for a little while. The next game that I plan on doing is going to be Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is the next game I'm playing, and again, I tried to play the original ones as much as possible, so I managed to find our big, thick, fat PlayStation 3. Got my account on there, went to the store and downloaded Demon's Souls, the original one, so we will be playing the original Demon's Souls on PlayStation 3. I am curious to see how that's going to go. From what I understand, I know a little bit about the development history of Demon's Souls, how troubled that one was as well, and we'll see how that goes. I imagine, I mean, even I remember playing Dark Souls and I still felt like that was a little bit rough around the edges with some of the mechanics and everything about it. It just felt like it needed a little bit more polish in certain places, and I feel like Demon's Souls is just going to be even more of that. So I'm curious to see how that's going to go. But I mean, I love Dark Souls 1. I love Dark Souls 3. Never played 2. Probably should do 2. We'll probably throw 2 in the list of things to do for the discussion, because that in itself is a lot to talk about. But yeah, I love Dark Souls 1, love Dark Souls 3. So I'm excited to see Demon's Souls, and hopefully I like that one as well. I don't know what else to say. You guys are great. Thank you everyone for watching, and hopefully you have a wonderful day. See you.